U.S. Secretary of Defense and Senator Bill Cohen, thank you. President Bush has just declared New York City a federal disaster area. U.S. Secretary of Defense and Senator Bill Cohen, thank you. U.S. Secretary of Defense and Senator Bill Cohen, thank you. President Bush has just declared New York City a federal. U.S. Secretary of Defense and Senator Bill Cohen. Thank you. President Bush has just declared New York City a federal disaster area. That will trigger a flow of federal aid to people and businesses. Just for example, Morgan Stanley had some 3,500 people in the South Tower, 25 floors of offices in the World Trade Center complex. I'm not saying that Morgan Stanley per se is going to get any of this federal help, but it's an indication of why the president has declared New York City a federal disaster area, to say nothing of the loss of life and the wounded. Exact totals on those killed and wounded, we frankly have no idea. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani has been straightforward throughout the day and evening, saying we simply don't know. It may be a long time before we know. David Martin reported a short while ago that a firefighting authority who'd been in the Pentagon for most of the day, the Pentagon struck by one of those hijacked airliners, said that he believed that there were 100 to 800 bodies in the Pentagon that have yet to be recovered. That was his opinion. Chaos reigned throughout New York City for at least part of this morning. People got steady and calmed after the initial shock of what was happening. As Troy Roberts reports, no one who lives or works in this city was untouched by it.
It started with a plane crash.
It's like, oh my God, it did. A plane crashed into the World Trade Center.
Literally out of the blue.
Clear as day, AA on the wing, just going, I'm like, what the heck is that? Is it filming a movie here or something? And then all of a sudden, bam.
Brothers Jeff and Scott Such were there, ground zero, with their video camera.
You're good right here in the corner. Stay on the corner.
So after the first strike, you're not thinking terrorist attack, are you?
You're thinking that this is a really huge accident, that I should be seeing this. So we just decided to go even closer.
The brothers continued shooting this videotape. As people trapped in the building began falling from the windows.
It almost looked as if someone had just like stepped backwards and had fallen through a window.
What's this other jet doing?
But the terrorists weren't done. 20 minutes later, another plane, another tower, another devastating attack.
Boom, just a loud explosion, and then you just look up at the sky, because that's where it came from. The noise came from above. You look up, and it's just like graffiti in the sky.
And that was just the beginning. On the ground, chaos as one of the famed Twin Towers crumbles. Firefighters and rescue workers attack the other tower, still standing, still burning. Who knows how many trapped inside.
So start going to your trucks. Make sure you got flashlights. If you don't have any lights, then let me know.
Oh, no!
Then that tower collapses too.
And we had some time to get some of the people out. Then there was those secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses. So I don't know how many people were in there. I know there was a lot of firefighters, a lot of public safety personnel were in there.
You call her and you tell her, let her hear your voice. She's going to need to hear your voice. Just like you need to hear my voice, I'm okay. I'm okay. Thank you. Bye. See you later. I love you.
All day long, more fallout.
Because there might be a bomb in the school, maybe.
A reported bomb threat. A dangerous gas leak.
This is Ed Sullivan. I want that building evacuated. All civilians, please head north of Morris Street.
Then, a nearby building collapses from the day's damage.
You are watching Building 7 at the World Trade Center collapse.
Amid the destruction and devastation, though, one remarkable thing did happen. Today's tragedy brought out the best in a city not always known for its kindness and humanity. 3 hours after the attack, area residents have put out an open call for volunteers to search the rubble for any signs of possible survivors.
They're here to volunteer. they're a laborer, they're a plumber, they're an electrician, whatever they are, it's to stay with you guys. If they're medical, they go across the street.
We're CPR and first aid trained.
You're prepared to go into that rubble?
Yeah, unfortunately we are. You know, whatever we can do to help out. I know there's not enough people in the city of New York to do it. I mean, it's a mess over there.
These volunteers say there is just one thing they want, something uniquely New York: street justice, tough and immediate.
I hope they're sending planes over there right now. Take care of business.
The world was caught unprepared for what happened today, especially in New York City and especially among those coordinating rescue efforts. 60 Minutes' Leslie Stahl has that story. Leslie?
Dan, ever since the Cold War, the federal government has had an elaborate plan to keep the government running if the Soviets ever attacked Washington. Over a year ago, I spoke with then President Clinton's counterterrorism czar, Dick Clark, who has the same job today under President Bush. He told us that when the Cold War ended, they decided to hold on to that plan to keep the government running.
We thought that individual buildings in Washington, and indeed perhaps all of Washington, could still come under attack. Only it might not be from the former Soviet Union, it might not be with a missile flying over the poles, it might be with a terrorist walking a weapon into our city. And the city could still be attacked and put out of action. And therefore we have developed a new program so that the federal government's emergency capabilities will continue to operate even if Washington doesn't.
So tell us what kind of operation you have up and running, or at least ready to be operational.
As soon as Washington goes down, the Pentagon, the Justice Department, the FBI, the Coast Guard, all of the key agencies of the U.S. government devolve power to other centers, some secret locations, some urban centers elsewhere, but we have a plan, we have trained people, we exercise it regularly, that if Washington isn't around, the U.S. government continues.
So is there a shadow Treasury Department somewhere right now?
For every one of our major departments, there's a shadow department somewhere right now.
There's a shadow Oval Office?
There are facilities where the president could operate, where a future president could operate, and for each of our key departments. Again, the message...
Is it like a bunker, or is it a... Can you give us any information?
It's an elaborate system, and it involves both old-fashioned bunkers and new-fashioned methods. Let's just say that. It's survivable. That's the key point.
Well, it seems that parts of this plan was activated, or at least contemplated today, when President Bush was flown from Louisiana to Nebraska, but then deactivated when it was determined not only that it was safe for him to return to Washington, but that it was important that it not look as though our government was crippled and on the run. Now, there has also been an elaborate plan here in New York City to react to something like what happened today, a terrorist attack with mass casualties. And as we came upon elements of that as we drove around the city. This is the scene we came upon 20 blocks north of the Trade Center. Row upon row of ambulances from all around New York and its suburbs. Had you gone through a training program for just this kind of an incident?
Maybe not this catastrophic, but it's definitely trained.
The ambulances were lined up in front of a huge commercial complex that was being transformed into an emergency triage center.
There's a coordinated plan in conjunction with the Fire Department and New York City EMS. The plan calls for that when we have volunteers, at this time we have over 300 attending surgeons, 300 residents, nurses, paramedics, physician assistants, and nurse practitioners, all inside, broken up into teams.
How many patients will you be able to operate on in here?
We have, I think, 50 operating suites and enough to handle about 400 patients that we've set up at this time.
More and more medical personnel arrived throughout the day. They waited and waited for the wounded. It's now more than 6 hours since the first plane hit the World Trade Center. The doctors, nurses, medical supplies are still coming into this triage center that they're still organizing. And as far as we can tell, they have not yet brought a single patient in from ground zero. In other words, from anybody who may have been in the World Trade Center itself. We're still seeing the ambulances lining up. No patients. They're still clearing the area down there. As emergency medical personnel had to change their plans on the fly, so did the big Wall Street investment firms. In driving around, we came upon a knot of people on 11th Street trying desperately to get their cell phones to work. And who were they?
Right at the moment, this is the command headquarters for Merrill Lynch around the world. So,
really, your
little townhouse in the village, yeah.
Is the global center of Merrill Lynch.
Right for the moment. Right for the moment, yeah.
Little black door right there.
Yeah.
This is Paul Critchlow's house in Greenwich Village. He's Merrill Lynch's director of communications. When the first plane hit the World Trade Center, his company's emergency evacuation plan kicked in.
We heard an explosion, and we thought it was most of us thought it was a supersonic, boom or something. And then we started getting reports from our own security people and obviously on TV and radio. And then we heard a second explosion, and I'd say right around 9 o'clock we ordered an evacuation of both of our buildings, which are adjacent to the World Trade Centers in the World Financial Center. So about 9,000 people, right.
9,000 people evacuated.
9,000 people, right.
So how did you get up here?
We walked.
9,000 people walked?
Well, everybody evacuated either to the north or to the south.
It's like a biblical exodus.
It really is. And so basically now you have these people are all senior executives and communications personnel. And this is where we're regrouping to try to figure out how we mobilize to keep our operations trading and all that sort of thing, and to find out what's the status with regard to all of our employees.
Government agencies, medical staff, and companies all had plans. But most New Yorkers simply didn't know what to do. And so, we're just a couple of blocks from that new Merrill Lynch headquarters. Just a couple of blocks, we came upon St. Vincent's Hospital. And all these people that you see behind me are all lined up in different lines to donate blood. They're lined up by their blood type. There must be between 5,000 and 10,000 people here.
You're sitting there wondering what you can do and how you can help, and you don't, you can't go down there.
And you feel helpless.
And you feel helpless, and you want to contribute, and
If you look around, there are so many people here who want to donate blood. There are people who are giving out free food. There are people giving water, and I mean, it's small comfort. But at the same time, it's like the worst brings out the best in people, and that's what you are seeing.
As I walked around today, there were a lot of people in the streets, and what struck me was how quiet it was. This is a city of really loud people, but not today. Taxi drivers weren't even blowing their horns. Now, you might have expected to find anger, but what we encountered was shock and sadness and, Dan, profound silence.
And that silence extends tonight. I want to show you a live picture. This is looking south.
This is a CBS 2 News special report, Attack on America.
I'm Harold Green. As you know, the nation's airports remain shut down, including LAX, Ontario, and John Wayne Airport. This is a news conference by an FAA spokesperson to bring us up to date on when the airports might be reopened.
And we have Lourdes Del Rio Valdez, Media Relations of the American Red Cross. And we'll begin with Lydia Kennard.
Good evening. No specific information has been provided to us as to when LAX will reopen. We have completed a sweep of all passenger terminals, and everything at this airport and Ontario is secure. There was one flight that arrived here this afternoon. It was an American Airlines flight that was a team of care workers to handle the families of victims on those American Airlines flights. That arrived at 6 p.m. It was a Boeing 737 from Dallas-Fort Worth. The reopening plan for the airport is being coordinated with our staff, the FAA, and the airlines. Currently, we have 178 aircraft that are grounded here. Remote Lot B remains to be the place, the collection point for passengers and anyone who needs to pick up passengers. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Michael DiGirolamo, our Director of Operations.
Hold your questions, please, till everyone has spoken, and we take the questions.
The FAA is working on two recovery plans. One is for the airspace, There's a lot of airplanes that need to be repositioned. They will be repositioned probably without passengers, and then eventually passenger flights will be put into the system. The airlines and the FAA in Washington are working on that recovery plan. There's also going to be a FAA security recovery plan. I would venture to say there's going to be some impact to airport screening and security as we currently know it, and there'll be some changes. Hopefully we'll have more information tomorrow, and we'll be able to pass it along to the traveling public. Paul?
Bernard Wilson, Chief of Airport Police at LAX. Our plans continue as we've been going on all day. We've been working with our local law enforcement agencies, especially Los Angeles Police Department, also with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. As I have mentioned several times during the day, we have been implementing existing plans that we already have in place here, the confidential security management plans, and they've all been working for us very well. The airport's in a state now where it is closed, the buildings are secure, and we're ready to commence planning. Actually, we have already started planning for the wind-up operation to get things going again when we get the word from the FAA.
Good evening, Deputy Chief Kalish, LAPD. Obviously, the Los Angeles Police Department will do whatever it takes to ensure the safety of the people of this city. We're working very, very closely with the Department of Airports, the airport police. This is a collaborative effort amongst many law enforcement agencies, each with our own role, providing support here to ensure the safety of the people of this city. And I have no additional information to report from the police department at this time.
This is an FAA news conference at LAX. You're watching it live.
Valdez with the American Red Cross of Greater Los Angeles. Public information. Right now we're setting up a shelter for 50 to 60 people that have been stranded due to forced airlines landing them here around the area. The shelter will be set up shortly and will be providing a warm and safe place for these people to stay the evening or as long as it is needed. In addition, since this is a long-term response, the American Red Cross is letting people at home know that we do need blood donations. Persons interested in donating blood may call 1-800-GIVE-LIFE. This number may sound busy. We urge people to continue trying so they may find information where they can go to a near center and donate blood. Red Cross mental health workers are assisting both airlines. We are standing by to provide mental health through our psychiatrists and psychologists at the airline sites where the families are convening. Any information of families listening may call the airlines for additional information about how the Red Cross mental health workers can help them. Red Cross has set up a hotline here in Los Angeles. For more information, they may call 213-739-4543 or log on to the website at acrossla.org.
We can take your questions, please, one at a time, and please direct your questions to the person who'd like to answer the question.
Where is that?
Yes, please.
Can I ask about airport security, and are there any plans by the FAA to put U.S. federal air marshals on board any of the flights once flights resume?
That's a question that probably should be answered by the FAA, and unfortunately they're not here tonight to answer the question. I can't comment or speculate on that.
What kind of additional security will be here at LAX?
Security to take care of items that don't show up on magnetometers, composite knives, composite implements that could be used to hold people at death's point.
I think we're at the same point with the answer to that. I don't want to speculate on anything at this point. We're in the right in the middle of managing an emergency right now, and long-term things will come a little later.
Cindy Geronimo, if you could step up for a second, question for you, if you would. You're talking about winding up or reconfiguring this airport. 178 planes on the ground. How do you organize them? How do you get passengers to them?
The FAA in Washington is coordinating with the airlines to exactly figure that out and how they're going to get this recovery system back and get the air transportation system back in service. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time, but the FAA is working with the airlines. That is their responsibility. We're prepared to assist in any way that we can to get passengers to airplanes and to get the airplanes out of the airport.
Have you war-gamed this or logistically tried to work this out on a sand table before, something this scale?
Here again, the FAA in Washington is coordinating that. They know what we have on the ground here. The airlines know what they have. where they want these airplanes positioned, and they're in the process of working with the FAA to move these aircraft to the appropriate airport to handle the passengers and get the system back working.
Ms. Kennard,
What
Ms.
impact
Kennard.
do you think this will have on screening? You said it would have an impact on screening and security. And can something like that be implemented by 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, which is a time that possibly the airport would be open again?
We have no time frame set. The FAA will make that determination. They're going to tell the airlines and the airport what they want on security levels. We'll follow those procedures and protocols, and we will be prepared to meet whatever they design and whatever they've come up with. And at this time, we don't have any more information than that, other than they are working on a recovery plan and a security plan.
Is it possible at this moment, with what you know, could this airport be up and working at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning? Is there any chance that could possibly happen?
We're prepared to assist the airlines and the FAA in moving passengers and airplanes through this airport, and we're prepared to do whatever we need to do.
Can it open by 9 a.m.?
If, yes, it can, and we're prepared to do that. And whether it'll be 9 o'clock in the morning, I'm not so sure, but we'll work with the FAA. You have the air traffic system and the security system to consider, but I think we're prepared to do whatever we need to do to meet what the FAA wants us to do.
How about talking about people being here at 9 a.m.? Being affected at 9 a.m. too?
As soon as the FAA lets us know what they want and what level of security they want, we're prepared to meet it. We believe that we can meet it. We've been working with other law enforcement agencies. If we need mutual aid, more officers in here, whatever we need to do, we're prepared to meet the FAA mandates, and we're prepared to operate this airport in accordance with what the FAA has deemed appropriate at this current level.
Question for the Red Cross, please. If you could step up, please, Mr.
Yes.
Yes. Have you been able to put some kind of a number on the number of people who are LA connected, who have families here?
No, we do not have that information. We do know that we have helped 2 to 3 families through our Red Cross mental health workers. That's all the information that we have at this time.
You say you set up shelters. What exactly are the shelters for?
The shelters is for the people that were forced to land in or around the area, that when the FAA required all the planes to land, this is people that are stranded. So the Red Cross is setting up shelters locally here. We have one shelter that we're preparing to open, 50 to 60 people or more if it's needed.
Are you working with the airlines, United and American, who each have a hotel for families of victims?
Red Cross is working with each of the airlines to provide mental health counseling, crisis teams for the family and friends of the victims of this airplane crash.
Are you compiling a list of Los Angeles, Southern California located people who may be victims?
As it is needed, we are doing so.
Where's your shelter? Yeah, where's the shelter?
The shelter is being set up as we speak, so we don't have an address right now.
Mr. Wilson, can we ask you a question, Mr. Wilson?
We will be adding shelters if needed. We have one shelter preparing to open. We're assessing an area locally for 50 to 60 people. If there is more people, then we will assess additional shelters if needed.
What have the mental health workers told you?
Mental health workers I have not spoken with.
Are you getting cooperation with United Airlines and American Airlines, who each have set up a hotel for families of victims?
Absolutely. We're working together with all city and county and airlines for this operation.
But again, do you have any kind of a raw number of the number of people from Southern California that may have been victims?
No, 2 to 3 families is what we have for how many we have helped for mental health crisis counseling.
Mr. Wilson, are we to understand that unless and until the FAA tells you we need increased security at this airport, it's going to be business as usual when you open up tomorrow or tomorrow afternoon?
Well, we currently have an airport that's not operating as an airport, so there is no business as usual right now.
Well, I'm asking you about the passengers who are going to arrive for the first flight. Are they going to have any increased screening?
They are going to have whatever screening measures are mandated by the federal government and whichever ones we are empowered to enforce, whatever they happen to be.
What would you tell passengers coming to the airport? Should it open on a limited basis in the morning and full operations later in the day? What's the best advice you could give to people coming to the airport?
The best advice I could give would be allow plenty of time, because there's going to be some new things here. There's going to be a lot of getting used to things and getting things wound up, recovering from being closed. The other thing is, I think there'd be a strong indication that, at least in the very beginning, we would probably restrict the passengers only to go through the screening stations And I think that just allow a lot of time for that.
What kind of new things?
Don't know yet.
In regard to airport operations, if you could come up again to the mic, please. Is this a top-down decision from the FAA? Are they simply going to say, we're ready to go, or are they awaiting feedback from folks like you here at LAX and other airports?
They have asked the airlines specifically for a recovery plan each airline is to bring to the FAA so that they can decide what airports they need to get up first, what hubs they need to get up first, and how the system is going to get up and operating. There's going to be planes ferrying around the United States empty. There will be eventually passengers on planes as they start getting into the system. It's a slow recovery. If you've ever been at any of the hub airports when they've had major weather disruptions in Chicago or Dallas or St. Louis, it takes 2 or 3 days to get those airports back into full operation. We expect that's what's going to happen nationwide. So operationally, there'll be some time before this goes. The FAA is asking the airlines to assist them in figuring out, give us priorities. Give us, you've got airplanes stranded in Canada. You've got airplanes stranded around the world. Get those back here. How do we facilitate that? They're asking the airlines. We're prepared to assist in any way we can.
Another operations question. If you don't open the airport till 9 or 12 and you don't have people coming, the baggage handlers, no one's going to be able to get to the airport until you say it's open. Is that correct?
We have contingency plans. We've talked to the airlines. I'm not prepared to discuss those with the media at this time, but there are contingency plans afoot. We will be prepared to operate this airport when the FAA gives us the signal.
So you've got a bunch of planes. They all need to be restarted, more or less. You've got full of baggage. It needs to be unloaded.
We have been meeting with the airlines all day. There is a recovery plan. I'm very confident that we'll be ready to go with the airlines when the FAA gives us that go-ahead.
Is there contingency that law enforcement would provide the security check?
We don't know. We don't wish to speculate at this time. We will see what happens and what the FAA mandates.
Are there plans to fly the family members back?
Absolutely. As Paul said, it's an air carrier decision. They're going to have to deal with that and how that's going to work out.
Special plane being...
No, we don't know of any, and we haven't heard of any.
Are you expecting a directive from the FAA tonight to let you know how to proceed tomorrow?
We are on standby. We don't know if it'll come tonight, after midnight, or tomorrow morning. We're just waiting for them to advise us what they need. There's teleconferences going on as we speak.
Two more questions. The planes are going to be leaving LAX tonight, going back to where you mentioned that planes have to kind of be reshuffled.
That depends on the airline and where they need to put their airplanes, if they need to ferry them out or if they don't need to.
That could possibly happen tonight?
Anything is possible.
Question for the LAPD, please. Deputy Chief Kalish, can you tell us, I know that you're working closely with the FBI, are there any suspects, any groups of people that are being detained, questioned here in the Los Angeles area in regard to these terrorist acts?
Well, clearly we'd be unable to comment on any investigation that's ongoing. I think it's important to realize this is a massive law enforcement response by many different agencies. Obviously, the airport police, LAPD, the FBI, many agencies, each with their own role, but all of us working together collaboratively during the investigation, also in the crisis response.
Can you talk to us about the number of bomb threats or possible bomb threats you received here today?
I'm unable to comment on that right now.
One more question. Chief Kalish, you have an anti-terrorist unit in the department, obviously. Was there at any time a threat made against any target in Los Angeles, including this airport?
I'd be unable to comment about that at this time. The Los Angeles Police Department does have an anti-terrorist division that gathers information. It works on, again, a collaborative effort with many different agencies, many federal agencies, and they're working as we speak, tracking down leads.
Okay, thank you all. We will reopen here at 6 a.m. tomorrow, and we'll let you know then when the next information will be there.
You've been watching a live news conference at LAX involving the FBI, the LAPD, Airport PD, the Red Cross. Our Drew Griffin is there. Drew, if you can hear me, what are your thoughts on what took place?
Well, we've been getting the same kind of message all day today. No real threat, a lot of precautionary moves. At one point, they did think that they had a suspicious car. They popped the trunk and found nothing. So a lot of this was precaution. And a lot of this, Harold, early on, we didn't know if there was a direct connection with all three, I should say 3 of the 4 flights that were heading to Los Angeles, whether or not there was any Los Angeles connection. That is why this airport actually went on a more heightened sense of alert than other airports across the nation, including evacuation. But again, we have seen the FBI come in here. Now the LAPD say they did not have really any specific threat. That's what they were telling me off the record to LA, that all this was precautionary. I will say that it will take, according to some FAA officials, about 3 hours once they decide to start at one end of the country and start flying to the through the rest of the country. So anything that happens will start on the East Coast and roughly take about 3 hours to get up and running nationwide. We're talking about the air traffic in the United States.
Reporter Drew Griffin, thank you for that live update. We have new information from the U.S. Marshal's Office. They want us to pass along this information that all federal buildings and courthouses in Southern California will remain dark tomorrow. All federal buildings and courthouses will not be open tomorrow. They advise if you have any dealings with the federal government tomorrow or in court, forget about it. We will keep you posted throughout the days ahead when we receive more information when LA gets back to being run in a normal fashion. Now let's return to CBS News as their continuous coverage on CBS 2 is straight ahead.
This has been a CBS 2 News special report. Attack on America.
Columbia University here in New York, former National Security Council member under Presidents Ford, Reagan, and Carter. Thanks for being with us, Mr.
Pleasure.
What type of planning went into this attack?
I think this is really a key issue because if you simply stop and think about the magnitude of this operation, they were able to penetrate security in 2 major airports, get people on board, provide their own pilots, because they obviously had their own pilots to do.
Suicide pilots.
Suicide pilots, but pilots who were qualified to fly a major airplane. And I personally watched the second plane go into the trade towers, and there was no flinching and no swerving. He flew right straight into it, and it was clear that no American pilot, no commercial pilot would ever have done that. And you stop and think about the amount of time, back it up, how much time would have been required, and the money and the organization. Let's put it this way. What if you're the president in the Cold War days and you tell the CIA that you'd like to create a little operation in Russia, which would basically hijack 4 airplanes and within a period of an hour crash them into major sites in the Soviet Union, and you had to organize that. It would have stretched our capabilities absolutely to the limit. And yet, that's what happened here today.
Reporters are always trained to follow the dollar, look for the money. Who finances an operation like this? Took a lot of money.
It took money and it took professionalism. I personally think that this had to have had a professional organization behind it. If you look at the kind of operations that Osama bin Laden and others have conducted in the past, the most sophisticated stuff they've been able to manage is a car bomb. And car bombs are dangerous and they're deadly, but they aren't like what we saw today. And this business of organizing, they had to recruit in the United States. They had to have Americans. They had to have some way of passing through the security in this country. That meant money, but it meant tremendous organization. And the fact that all of this, if you stop and think about it, it's amazing, went unreported, unnoticed by any of our systems, which were watching all of these specific organizations, raises the question, were we looking in the right place?
Well, let's pursue that question. Whom do you think may be responsible for this?
You know, I really don't want to speculate because I think it's, at this stage it's a pure guess. Everybody is speculating about Osama bin Laden, maybe so. But if so, he has moved his operations to a level that this is the largest and most successful terrorist operation in history. And he was simply not up to that. He had a bomb in a boat, and he had some car bombs outside embassies.
This is far beyond
this
that.
Is something of an, and it's in this country.
Well, let me
We're
answer
not
the
talking
question.
about East Africa.
I know you don't want to speculate, and neither do I, but it's inevitable that these questions flow on. That if it was or was not Osama bin Laden, you've said it was well financed, it was exceptionally well planned, a very sophisticated and large operation. If the president asked you, what are the chances, Gary Sick, that Saddam Hussein or one of the radical mullah groups in Iran were responsible, would you rule it out?
Saddam Hussein today said that this was the operation of the century. And there was great celebrations in Baghdad, not in Iran. But, you know, if you had to look for a culprit in terms of organization, structure, money, professionalism, all of the things that go with it, that's one place that you would certainly have to look. And I think that our intelligence services are going to have to do a really careful step back from where they've been looking and start looking under some different rocks, because I think there are some things going on that we haven't really observed.
We have only a few seconds left here, but we spend billions of dollars on intelligence. Does this or any other president have the will to zero base our whole intelligence operations?
No, but intelligence works when you're looking in the right place, and I've seen it. The Israelis in 1973 and elsewhere had the information, but they didn't know what to do with it. They were looking in the wrong way, and they thought they knew what was going on, and they interpreted it wrongly. I think that we need to step back from it and take a hard look at our interpretation of the information that we probably already got.
Gary Sick, thank you very much.
Indeed.
Around the country today, schools closed, churches opened, and the daily routine of life was suddenly changed. Bob McNamara has more now on the attack on America and how it was felt throughout America.
Half a continent away, flags in Dallas were lowered to half staff as fears climbed.
I'm scared to death about what's going on, and it's just crazy. Everything's going crazy.
No matter where you were, no place seems safe.
I feel like a sitting duck, and I just can't wait to get home.
The doomsday images that filled the day's television screens had Americans on edge. Iowa's state capitol was evacuated. Shopping mall parking lots were vacant. And airports coast to coast were eerily empty as flights were canceled and jetliners parked.
Yes, I'd like to make reservations.
But most stranded travelers kept calm.
I'd rather them shut down everything and inconvenience everybody than to have another tragedy happen.
In Dallas and other cities, a flood of donors answered emergency calls for blood.
Unfortunately, it takes a disaster like this to really show America does care about one another.
The crisis seemed to touch everybody.
First thing I did, I got up and I came in my pajamas actually, and I just, as fast as I could, try to donate blood.
But the scene here recalled another terror attack.
The only thing I can really compare it to would be the Oklahoma City bombing. The response to that was tremendous as well.
Until today, the Oklahoma City bombing had been the worst act of terror on American soil. And the nightmare of those 6-year-old images brought many to the Oklahoma City National Memorial.
We wanted to stop by and just get a feeling again for what people are feeling in New York, and obviously you get a hard feeling in your stomach when you come to a place like this.
Churches in hundreds of cities and towns held prayer vigils as they do during this nation's darkest hours. But any gathering today was a source of comfort for many.
We'll overcome what's happened. It may take a little time, but we'll do it.
Tonight, though far from the day's chaos, many Americans are feeling vulnerable and trying to stay hopeful in a world full of hurt. Bob McNamara, CBS News, Dallas.
A world full of hurt. And the exact death tolls in New York and in Washington remain open to question tonight. Nobody really knows the number of people killed and or injured. We do believe we know that 285 people, at least 285 people aboard the 4 hijacked planes that were crashed died. So we know that death toll figure is pretty solid. If you were listening closely, you probably did note, if you weren't with us at the time when Gary Sick spoke a few moments ago, one of this country's ranking experts on national security affairs, and he said, this is almost a direct quote, that it may or may not turn out to be Osama bin Laden was at the head of this operation, but, said Gary Sick, it does not fit his profile. And Gary Sick's counsel was to look at other places for perhaps allies who could have been involved in this, or some kind of state-sponsored terrorism. Gary Sick. Now, this attack on America was an attack first and foremost on powerful symbols of our beloved United States. Richard Schlesinger has more on what these symbols represent and why they were targets.
It didn't take long for the images of this sneak attack on the United States to remind people of another one, December 7th, 1941.
A date which will live
in infamy.
Pearl Harbor is one of the first things that comes to mind.
Evan Cornog is a Columbia University historian and journalist.
After Pearl Harbor, there was the Japanese fleet to go after. One knew where to find the enemy. Here, it's a much more complicated issue.
Pearl Harbor was an attack on the U.S. Navy, a symbol of American power at the time. Today's attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center struck at modern symbols of American power and prestige.
Those towers are saying, look at us, we're important. And somebody has come along and said, you're not as important as you think.
The pictures of the destruction are destined to become images for the ages.
The image of that airplane crashing into the side of the building, the image of the collapsing towers, those are going to be things that just stay riveted in our memories. Like the flag at Iwo Jima. You see those pictures and a whole era and a whole set of issues is called to mind. And I think we haven't yet seen, don't know yet what all the defining images of this event are going to be. But they're going to be there in our memories as long as we live.
The symbolism of this attack was impossible to ignore overseas.
The feeling is that throughout the world, the Americans are not as powerful as they were thought to be. Therefore, these terrorists were really going to achieve a symbolic victory.
But officials here in New York and in Washington know the difference between a symbolic victory and a real victory. When the World Trade Center was brought to the ground, the country was brought to its knees. But terrorism experts say just for a while. For years, authorities have practiced for attacks like today's, many times under the direction of Jerome Hauer, who was an emergency management official in New York.
You have to plan for the worst. That's just, particularly in a city like in New York, in Washington, D.C., the real thing is never like a drill. The enormity of the situation today is just is just incredible.
Did the bad guys win today? They got that image. They got
they certainly struck a blow today. There's no question about it. We are a very resilient nation, and we are very resilient people.
And we're a very different people than we were just before 9 o'clock this morning when this all began. Richard Schlesinger, CBS News, New York.
And now to Washington and CBS News Chief White House Correspondent John Roberts. John?
Well, Dan, we have some late-breaking information. After his address from the Oval Office, the president went immediately into a briefing with his national security team, Condoleezza Rice. I believe that Colin Powell may have been there upon his return from South America. A senior administration official telling CBS News tonight that there is good information that Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda group was behind today's terror attacks, Dan. Now, to give you some kind of an idea of just how seriously they were taking security, moving the president around. Some video that came into us late today, taken from inside Air Force One by cameraman George Christian, who was on the plane with the president. You can see outside the wing of the aircraft, Air Force One being shadowed by two fighters. There's an F-16 off of one wing and I believe an F-15 off of the other wing. So, Dan, this was on the way back from Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska as the president was coming back to Andrews. They were definitely taking this seriously, but apparently the president comfortable enough that he's back in the White House tonight. Dan?
John Roberts live at the White House. And so from out of the skies, tragedy has rained down on a nation. It was swift, deliberate, terrifying. In a matter of moments, in one city, a towering American icon was destroyed. And in another, the greatest symbol of our national might was set ablaze. What once seemed unthinkable has happened. On a bright summer morning, under a clear and cloudless sky, terror struck. The toll has been devastating. It may be days or even weeks before the final accounting is done in terms of dead and wounded. To grasp the enormity of it is almost too much for the heart to bear. This night, we can only look back in sorrow at a world that has suddenly, perhaps irrevocably, been changed. And tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, and in days and years to come, we will look at the calendar and remember September 11th, 2001. It is a date that will be etched in history, engraved in stone, and in our memories. The day of the attack on America. We leave you tonight with these images, flashpoints from a day that cannot be forgotten. For the latest on this still unfolding story, stay tuned to the CBS station. There'll be complete coverage on the early show and on the CBS Evening News. and we will have continuing CBS News coverage on some of these stations. On some other stations, we will not see until sometime tomorrow morning. I'm Dan Rather in New York.
Tonight, attack on America.
And I saw the plane hit the building.
And a nightmare unfolds.
It's got to be a terrorist attack.
In New York, hijacked planes slam into the World Trade Center.
Move out of the way! Let's go! Hey, come on!
And the Twin Towers crumble. In Washington, a plane dives into the Pentagon.
We are at threat condition Delta. That is the highest condition that we can go to.
And near Pittsburgh.
Witnesses reported seeing the large passenger plane take a nosedive.
Still another plane crashes.
Some 44 people on board, all believed dead.
A country is outraged. The world is stunned.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Make the whole city room to breathe!
Who is behind it? What happens next? The deadliest attack ever to strike America. As terror hits home.
And this is continuing CBS News coverage of the attack on America. It may not be over yet. Tonight, a truckload of explosives was taken from a truck around the George Washington Bridge, which spans the Hudson River from New Jersey to Manhattan. The FBI is reported to have arrested 2 male suspects with a truck with explosives in the vicinity of the George Washington Bridge. Authorities say there were enough explosives in the truck to bring down the bridge. Now, whether this was connected with the other events of the day, we simply can't know. But this happened after a long day. It started when 4 hijacked jets became flying bombs, smashing into the Twin Towers of New York's World Trade Center and into the Defense Department's Pentagon just outside Washington. And a jet that may have been headed toward another Washington area target went down in southwestern Pennsylvania. Tonight at Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan, the devastation is nearly beyond belief. Both of the World Trade Center towers collapsed after being hit each by a hijacked aircraft. And then a third major building of the Trade Center complex, World Trade Center Building 7, collapsed. Rescue workers are digging through the enormous piles of rubble, hoping against hope to find survivors, including hundreds, apparently, of missing firefighters and New York City police officers. New York hospitals are jammed with victims, pushing the city's medical capacity to the very limit. Some people today jumped from windows of the World Trade Center, jumped to their death. Mayor Giuliani asked that New York City be declared a federal disaster area. President Bush has done that tonight. Hundreds more people may be dead at the Pentagon. A firefighting official at the Pentagon said that he had been inside for hours and believed 100 to 800 bodies could be inside there. The pictures you just saw were of what happened at the World Trade Center itself. Now, Dateline Tokyo stocks broke down through the key 10,000 point mark Wednesday morning. That's for the first time in 17 years, as traders dumped shares in reaction to terrorist attacks in New York City and Washington. The dollar was sharply lower against the yen. Financial markets in this country will be closed tomorrow. They'll reopen at a yet unannounced time. With all of this, European leaders were quick to react to today's events and quick to express their shock and outrage. CBS News correspondent Mark Phillips is covering for us in London.
World Trade Center. The attacks may have been on American targets, but this was a global event, witnessed in shock and disbelief live on television around the world. Events even being followed in Afghanistan, where the immediate chief suspect, Osama bin Laden, operates from. The Taliban regime was quick to deny that he could have had anything to do with the attacks, but the world wasn't believing denials. It was taking precautions. Finance houses in London and Frankfurt were evacuated. Leaders were outraged, offering sympathy and support.
This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism. We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy. And we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
Security was tightened in British and European aviation, all flights banned over central London. And from old enemies came support for the US's new fight against its new enemy. Russians laid wreaths at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. President Vladimir Putin offered condolences and called for international efforts to combat terrorism, which he called the plague of the 21st century. France's Jacques Chirac called the attacks monstrous acts. Germany's Gerhard Schroeder called them a declaration of war against the civilized world. Even Iran's President Khatami joined a long list of leaders condemning the attacks. These were shots truly heard around the world. Share prices, already low, began dropping sharply as news of the attacks spread. Across the globe, there was the sense that nothing was the same.
I'm certain in the short term we're going to face a much more restricted world, a world which is much more security conscious, much more anxious, and much more fearful.
And from security analysts, a sobering view of America, not the omnipotent superpower, but America the vulnerable.
They have the most sophisticated military technology in the world, and yet they were caught completely by surprise, demonstrating that a very, very weak military force, perhaps from the Middle East, was capable of inflicting a great symbolic defeat on the United States.
The only dissenting voice to be heard today came from Baghdad, Iraqi state television calling these attacks the fruit of U.S. crimes against humanity, they said. The world is not only stunned this evening, it's a little bit fearful that this was not just one act and one terrible day, but that it may have been the beginning of a chain of unpredictable and uncontrollable events, none of them good. Dan.
Mark Phillips reporting live from our bureau, our CBS News Bureau in London. Thanks. Now, John Roberts, our chief White House correspondent, reported a short while ago that he had spoken to officials, credible and high-ranking officials, who indicated that there was a gathering body of opinion believing that Osama bin Laden was directly connected to the events of today. And these officials said that retaliation, when it comes, they didn't indicate when it would be what they called precise and definitive, I believe were the words that he used. Now, this is against a backdrop of some other experts in the field, including Gary Sick from Columbia University, whom we interviewed earlier, who were cautioning that, well, it might have been bin Laden in one way or the other, but it doesn't bear the marks of his previous operations. This was a large operation, required a lot of planning and a lot of money. In other words, President Bush, you can bet, is hearing some differing opinions, at least in a minority view, saying maybe bin Laden, but on the other hand, maybe bin Laden plus, or maybe somebody else, and a lot of talk about, before any retaliation comes, to zero-based thinking about who may have pulled this off. All that in background. Now, we've been using the upgraded figure, the new figure of 285 people believed to have been killed on the 4 hijacked airliners that crashed. This figure's been up and down during the day. 266 is now a figure given. What we do know is that well over 250 people on the crashed hijacked airliners died today. That's to say nothing of the untold numbers of people, we simply don't know how many, who died in the events in and around the World Trade Center here in New York City and in the Pentagon itself. The shock waves of today's events were felt not only in the United States, but around the world, notably in the Middle East, as our Middle East correspondent David Hawkins now reports.
In parts of the Muslim world today, there was celebration. Some Palestinians danced in the streets upon hearing the news of the worst ever terrorist attack on American soil, perhaps the worst ever anywhere. Palestinian militant groups, however, denied having anything to do with the 4 hijacked jets, and Palestinian Authority President Yasser Arafat condemned the attacks.
First of all, I am offering my condolences, the condolences of the Palestinian people to the American President, President Bush, to his government, to the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked. Completely shocked. Unbelievable.
No stranger to terrorism, Israel's Prime Minister Ariel Sharon expressed solidarity with America. He declared tomorrow to be a national day of mourning in Israel.
The fight against terror is an international struggle of the free world against the forces of darkness who seek to destroy our liberty and our way of life. I believe that together we can defeat these forces of evil.
But while the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians has been boiling, some Israeli terrorism experts say that the Palestinian militants behind the attacks on Israel don't have the ability to carry out such a complicated operation against the United States, and it's unlikely they'd risk American retaliation.
A group that decides to carry out an attack of this sort, or a state, must have a mentality of doomsday, of Armageddon, of all or none.
That description does fit the radical Islamic fundamentalist Osama bin Laden, who's declared a religious war against the United States.
Bin Laden is a fighter for Islam in the world in general. And that makes him not only an uncompromising fighter in the United States, against the United States, but also probably a guy that has a worldview of us against them.
Of course, Osama bin Laden holds very extreme religious views that are not shared by most Muslims. Arab groups are cautioning against prematurely jumping to conclusions and are concerned about guilt by association. And many, if not all, Islamic nations, including Libya and Iran, have joined in condemnation of today's terrorist attacks. Dan?
David Hawkins at our bureau in the Middle East in Jerusalem. In Japan, another day has dawned, and there may already be indications of what effects the attacks will have on world markets. Barry Peterson is live in our Tokyo bureau. Barry?
Good evening, Dan. Well, we really were braced for some sort of a financial meltdown today, and it's been bad. Hong Kong down about 7%, Singapore about 5%. But the granddaddy market of them all is Tokyo. Now, when it opened, it dropped 7%, and then it bottomed out. And it's come back up a little bit for a loss of about 5%. Tolerable, not a financial meltdown. And this situation has really had an impact on all Americans living across Asia. About an hour ago, the aircraft carrier Kitty Hawk was underway. No word on its destination. But it is only one of several Navy ships from here, now at sea or calling sailors back from leave and preparing for action. It was late night here when the explosions occurred. Military officials quickly sealed U.S. installations. Some 100,000 American military personnel are based in Asia. Japanese police added another layer of security around the bases. It wasn't just the military. U.S. embassies and consulates were closed. Security tightened. And in Tokyo, U.S. citizens were told to, quote, review their personal security precautions. Japan's prime minister issued a tough statement, calling the attack extremely vicious and unforgivable. Adding, I am outraged. He went on nationwide television moments ago, telling the Japanese he is ready to send rescue workers to New York if need be, and will try his best to avoid economic chaos. Now, the flight situation in Asia is also a bit confused. There were a number of flights from Tokyo, 30 of them, that were turned around in midair and brought back to Asia. Another 170 flights canceled out of Tokyo on the way to the United States, as well as flights from Hong Kong, Singapore, Korea. So really, Dan, for those people who have friends in Asia who are vacationing, or perhaps were here on a business trip, everybody is safe and sound. It may just be a while before they get back home. Dan?
Barry Peterson, our Asia correspondent in Tokyo. As we speak, in Lower Manhattan, the grim search goes on, not just for bodies and wounded people, but survivors who may be trapped in the rubble. New York City police have now said that they had received calls from people trapped in the Twin Towers, or they know of calls from people trapped in the Twin Towers, The source who requested anonymity gave no further details. In one of the calls, a surviving civilian said he was trapped with a police officer. The officer was among those missing in the aftermath of the attack, according to the police. The situation in Lower Manhattan remains grim and in many ways desperate, as the first to put out the fires, make sure there are no other fires, to check out possibly buildings that may yet crumble, and then the search for bodies and survivors goes on while New York City hospitals treat the wounded. Major League Baseball postponed a full schedule of regular season games for the first time since D-Day in 1944. It was June 6, 1944. Joining us now, James Woolsey, Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, during the Clinton administration, and a terrorism expert. Mr. Woolsey, thank you for being with us.
Good to be with you, Dan.
Your opinion, this does or does not bear the signature marks of an Osama bin Laden operation?
It's quite possible bin Laden was involved, and indeed even that his group carried it out. But it strikes me, as it did Gary Sick, that there may well be something else behind it. And one reasonable candidate is Saddam Hussein. The Clinton administration ignored the early efforts of the FBI agent Jim Fox, who was in charge of the first World Trade Center investigation in '93. Fox, who's now dead, thought that there was a substantial chance that Ramzi Yousef and the World Trade Center plotters were involved with the Iraqi government, with Iraqi intelligence. I think a reasonable case can be made that ought to get a very, very serious look, a much more serious look than it got during the 8 years of the Clinton administration, or from what I'm aware so far in the first few months of this administration. One thing that's very interesting is that Yousef was at the center of two plots. One was the World Trade Center bombing in '93, and the other was a plot to blow up a large number of American airliners in the Pacific. He was caught as a result of some mistakes he made in the course of that second effort. What happened today is sort of a combination of those two. And if it does turn out that Ramzi Yousef had ties to the Iraqi government, there's circumstantial evidence, not more yet, but at least enough to take a very tough look at the question of whether, as Gary Sick suggested, Saddam Hussein may be behind this.
Mr. Woolsey, difficult question for you. Recently and formerly a director of the CIA, but this country and the people of this country spend billions every year on intelligence. And here we have a situation where a very sophisticated operation that required a lot of planning in a lot of places by a lot of people, there was no warning about it. Put that in perspective for us.
Well, first of all, there may have been some warning that something was going to take place. You remember some weeks ago, we had to cancel an exercise, military exercise in Jordan, and had to put some ships out to sea in the Persian Gulf because we were worried that something was going to happen. It's often the case in circumstances like this that if something may go wrong, you get a vague indication, but nothing precise. Another problem is that the CIA has more trouble than it really needs to penetrating terrorist groups because some guidelines that were put out in late 1995, I hasten to say after I had left the job, makes it more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult to recruit spies inside terrorist organizations who may have some violence in their background. The problem is everybody in a terrorist organization is a human rights violator, so if you're not going to recruit bad folks, you're not going to know what's going on. Also, as Gary Sick suggested, we may have in the U.S. government been not looking closely enough at state sponsorship. The Clinton administration was quite fond of this theory that terrorism was either sort of a pickup team, a loose association of terrorists, or it was bin Laden, and they did not look hard at the Iraqi government. I think that there may now be some incentive, I hope, for the federal government to take a close look at some of the past terrorist incidents as well as everything they have on this and see whether, if bin Laden was involved, he might have had a Wizard of Oz behind the curtain pulling some levers.
Mr. Woolsey, thank you very much.
Good to be with you.
Also joining us tonight for some perspective, the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator Bob Graham. Senator, thank you for being with us.
Good evening, Dan.
What can you tell us about what's happened here today?
Dan,
as a member of the Senate and chairman of the Intelligence Committee, we have not yet had a briefing. We were supposed to have had one this afternoon, but because the president's schedule and he was delayed getting back to Washington, and the protocol is that he is briefed before anyone else, that session was canceled and will be rescheduled for tomorrow afternoon.
Senator, you're chairman now of the Intelligence Committee since the Democrats have taken over the Senate. Are you confident that our intelligence agencies are as sharp, as alert, as they ought to be for this kind of thing? I have in mind that apparently there was no prior warning about this. I underscore the word apparently.
No, I'm not. In fact, I'm quite confident that in several areas our intelligence services are not what they have been and what they need to be to respond to these new crises. As an example, we have allowed our human intelligence spies to be relatively displaced by machines. Now, we might have been able to have taken pictures of Soviet submarines, but we can't take pictures of what's in the mind of a terrorist in Afghanistan. We've got to build up that human capability. We also have seen a degradation of our eavesdropping ability, listening to important conversations or gathering materials that are transmitted over the air. We need to build up our signals intelligence. And finally, we haven't been making the kind of investment in the analytical side of intelligence. We collect an enormous amount of material. It's analogous to picking that particular golden needle out of that haystack in order to convert all that collection into usable intelligence.
Senator Bob Graham, you've heard the arguments pro and con. Yes, it's definitely bin Laden, indications and intelligence information has bin Laden. And on the other side, some are saying, wait just a minute, this kind of operation may well have had some kind of state sponsorship and financing. How do you come out on that argument?
How I come out on that is we need to move as expeditiously but also as carefully as possible to identify who was the perpetrator. You recall after Oklahoma City there was an immediate assumption that this must have been an Islamic group. It turned out to be a U.S. militia group that had committed that heinous offense. We are going to respond very aggressively against whoever is finally determined to have been responsible for this act. This is an act of war against the United States and will be treated as an act of war. So unlike the parallel that has been cited often today, Pearl Harbor, where we knew who the enemy was because they had rising suns painted on their airplanes, we are not at this point that certain as to who our adversary is. We need to make that determination, and then we need to respond very aggressively.
Senator Bob Graham, Democrat of Florida, chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, live from our Washington Bureau. Thank you very much, Senator.
Fine, thank you.
While the extraordinary and horrific events were unfolding at the World Trade Center this morning, one of our CBS News correspondents, Carol Maureen of 60 Minutes 2, became a part of the story herself.
After the second tower went down, I was directed by a firefighter who said, walk down the middle of the road because you don't know what's going to come down, at which point we heard a rumble like I've never heard before. A rolling blast of fire, a rolling column of fire towards us. A firefighter ran towards me. We ran as fast as we could. I lost my shoes. I fell down. He picked me up and slammed me into a wall and covered me with him. There are still people in there, excuse me, I've breathed a fair amount of soot. The personnel, the police and the fire working in there are doing so against really dangerous odds. Dan, one of the things that after we thought we were safe by the CBS satellite truck, I began to make my way back here to the broadcast center, and suddenly there were firefighters again running, yelling, a gas main is going to blow. Emergency vehicles began turning and racing away, and I banged on the door of one of them. 6 guys inside let me in and took me to 42nd Street, where a bus driver stopped his empty bus and got me here. All along the way, the most awe-inspiring part of this was that people remained so calm, so resolute, anguished, but clearly purposeful in doing the right thing, in being civil, in trying to help. It was beyond sort of awesome to me.
And when one sees the photographs of those mostly young firefighters, police, and other rescue workers, we now have the realization that some of them may very well be dead because they were going back inside the scene.
And I think of this one firefighter whose name I don't know, who did everything he could in the midst of that to offer me protection. And I don't know to this moment if he is one of the ones who turned back and went back in.
Carol Maureen, thanks. On the other side of the country, anxious relatives today were awaiting word of loved ones on planes that would never arrive in California. CBS News correspondent Sandra Hughes is live in Los Angeles. Sandra?
Dan, the Los Angeles International Airport remains closed at this hour. Family members of the victims of the United and American flights gathered at 2 nearby hotels, where the mood, according to grief counselors, is somber, not hysterical, but very sad. Now, just a few minutes ago, there was a press conference that was held by airport officials. What they were explaining was that there are 178 planes still grounded here at LA International Airport. And so I believe that we do have the videotape for my piece. Let's go to that right now, and that's talking about the family members of these victims of the flights. Families of the American Airlines victims, surrounded by tight security, were whisked to a private area to be counseled by grief specialists from the airline and the Salvation Army.
There's very little that one can say at a time like this. We simply want to be with them and to comfort them as best we can.
But some people just needed to hold on. Confused passengers looking for guidance stood stunned. Most turned away as all domestic flights were canceled. International flights were to be diverted to nearby Ontario Airport until it closed too.
And then I got here and I read the board and everything was canceled. So I was like, okay. So yeah, I have no idea what I'm gonna do.
Most had just heard the news of the plane crashes and wondered how many had been killed. The scene was chaotic. Police tape held back anyone who tried to get inside the United terminal as the LAPD bomb squad suited up outside. At a nearby power plant, a suspicious package brought panic. It was nothing. By mid-morning, the entire airport was evacuated.
The FAA mandated early on that we close down LAX and Ontario airports in California, which we have done.
And as officials are saying tonight, they're still waiting for word from the FAA on when they can reopen Los Angeles International Airport. Dan?
Sandra Hughes reporting live from Los Angeles. New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani has repeated now that he believes and has strong reason to believe that some people are still alive in the debris of the World Trade Center buildings and or surrounding buildings. So there's a desperate battle now against time to find those people. And if there's even one person alive in the rubble, those firemen, policemen, and rescue workers are determined to pull them out. Cranes and bulldozers are being used to clear the streets. Rescue workers are working now with pickaxes and shovels, as they will be throughout the night. They're digging for bodies. They're trying to find anyone who may be alive in the rubble. Looking south, the Empire State Building dominating the right-hand portion of your screen, and in the distance, the smoke, that ever-present terrible smoke. And one has come to hate this smoke during the day, just the scene of it. Now, a report from Washington, 800 people reportedly, this is reportedly, allegedly killed at the U.S. Defense Department. Earlier, there were reports that perhaps as many as 100 to 800 had been killed. The source on this report, I'm not sure about it, but David Martin at the Pentagon has been working there today. Unconfirmed, but from usually reliable sources, 800 reported killed at the Pentagon. I'm going to put that under the "we'll see" and "I'm still skeptical" banner, but that's the latest report from Washington. Now, our CBS News coverage will continue as we go along of the attack on America.
Tonight, attack on America.
And I saw the plane hit the building.
And a nightmare unfolds.
It's got to be a terrorist attack.
In New York, hijacked planes slam into the World Trade Center.
Move out of the way! Let's go! Hey, come on!
And the Twin Towers crumble. In Washington, a plane dives into the Pentagon.
We are at threat condition Delta. That is the highest condition that we can go to.
And near Pittsburgh.
Witnesses reported seeing the large passenger plane take a nosedive.
Still another plane crashes.
Some 44 people on board, all believed dead.
A country is outraged. The world is stunned.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Take a halt! Give him room to breathe!
Who is behind it? What happens next? The deadliest attack ever to strike America. As terror hits home.
Good evening once again from CBS News World Headquarters in New York. CBS's live special coverage of the attack on America continues. Now, one of the headlines of this hour from the Reuters news agency. Reuters news agency reports, and Reuters is the one carrying this, 800 dead at the Pentagon. However, when one checks in a little further, Reuters' source on the story would be considered by CBS News, at least we put it in the skeptical category for the moment. And David Martin is going to bring us up to date in a few moments directly from the Pentagon on that situation. But there's no absolute confirmation that that many people are dead at the Pentagon. Earlier reports had said, a firefighter who had been in the building said the dead might be 100 to 800. But I want to put that in perspective for you. President Bush tonight declared New York City a disaster area, means it's eligible for considerable federal aid to individuals and to businesses. The president told the American people tonight, quote, thousands of lives were ended, unquote, in the terror attacks on targets in New York City and in the nation's capital. Here in New York City, the desperate search goes on, deeper, ever deeper into the night, at the site where two hijacked commercial U.S. jetliners, within a space of minutes, were used to ram each of the twin towers of the World Trade Center and destroying them. Both towers, where most days around 50,000 people work, collapsed. A third building in the tower complex, World Trade Center building number 7, 47 stories tall, collapsed late in the day. New York City police sources quoted by Associated Press say calls have been coming in from people still trapped in the wreckage of the Twin Towers. Mayor Giuliani recently said, very recently tonight, within the last few minutes, repeated that he believes that there are some people still alive in the rubble in and around the World Trade Center. And word late tonight that two suspects are in FBI custody after a truckload of explosives was discovered around the George Washington Bridge. That bridge links New York to New Jersey over the Hudson River. Whether the discovery of those explosives had anything to do with other events of the day is unclear, but the FBI has two suspects in hand, said the truck load of explosives, enough explosives were in the truck to do great damage to the George Washington Bridge. But they arrested the two suspects and they're questioning them as we speak. President Bush says the death toll at the World Trade Center and today's other targets is in the thousands. Some people were killed when a third hijacked jetliner was sent slamming into the Pentagon. A fire department source from the Washington area says 100 to 800 bodies may still be trapped in the complex. Their bodies. And then we're at the top of this section, we said to you that Reuters reported that 800 were dead at the Pentagon. That has not, I repeated, not been confirmed. A fourth hijacked aircraft today, possibly in the process of being diverted to the Washington area and aimed for some target unknown, eventually crashed in southwestern Pennsylvania, about 80 miles from Pittsburgh. Between 250 and 285 people are believed to have been killed on the hijacked planes alone. The figures bounce around during the night. We feel comfortable saying it's more than 250 people killed on the hijacked planes, in the hijacked planes alone, maybe as many as 285. There were stabbings on at least 2 of the planes, stabbings of flight attendants, while the hijackers went about their ghastly work. The FAA has ordered a first-ever shutdown of air traffic nationwide at least through noon tomorrow. Here's the New York City mayor live with, we hope, additional information.
It's 212-560-2730. And then as we have information about people either who have been recovered or are dead, we'll let them know that.
Is our morgue able to handle this?
We had a meeting with the medical examiner earlier, went over it with him. He believes that he's able to handle it. He'll start handling it at 30th Street, which is the morgue for Manhattan. He'll then be able to move up to the Bronx, where he also has facilities. And then we have the possibility of using the pier on the west side, which is set aside in case the numbers get too difficult to handle. But he thinks he can handle at least a good deal of it tomorrow and the next day, right in Manhattan.
Commissioner Bonnet, can you talk about the loss of the fire department?
We've got over 300 people that are missing that we can't account for. We believe that many of them are gone. We don't. We'll keep looking. We have hundreds of people over there now trying to find as many possible locations that they might be in some way in a void or whatever, and still be able to breathe and still alive. But we believe that most of these people, I think, are going to be unable to pull out. So we'll just keep working on it. I have a number I'd like to give. We haven't been able to make any contact with the families because we're still unsure of the situation. So the number for the families who haven't spoken to their loved one in the course of this whole horrible day, if they call this number, we'll at least tell them that that this is a person that's missing, or that we have had some contact with this person. The number would be 718-999-2541 is a number that we'll be using at Fire Department headquarters.
What about
It's just for firefighters.
What about Chief Dan?
Just for firefighters, firefighters and fire officers, EMS personnel. I would we'll man those numbers. That number will roll over to 10 lines, and we'll be able to just try to give them some information. We don't have a lot, so that's why we haven't been calling them like we would normally do.
How close? And what about the teams? How close are estimated to get to Deborah Whitman?
I'm sorry, Deb.
What about the top members?
Note, this gentleman says that some 300 New York City firefighters are missing. We pick it up live again now.
I don't know what to say. We lost people that have given over 40 years. Commissioner Feehan has had every job in the department. Probably the most valuable person in the department. When I got this job, the mayor and Commissioner Safer said, make sure you keep Bill Feehan. Haven't regretted that one day. He's given a whole life to this department. Chief Gansey, the same thing. Chief of department, 33 years, 34 years. Ray Downey, we just honored him with a dinner. Almost 40 years of service, world renowned for situations like this, telling me how dangerous it was when we first got there, all the possibilities, everything that he was trying to do to, get the people out. Father Judge, I don't know if you know Father Judge, one of the nicest men you could possibly find in the whole world. We haven't found other people yet either. I don't even want to mention their names. Some of the best people in this department. I can't find anybody from 5 rescues and 7 squads, and it's just it's a devastating thing. I don't know. Well, the fire department will recover, but I don't know how.
Commissioner Carrick, in the police department, do you have any idea how many people you're looking for at this time right now?
The number we're looking for is in excess of about 32, 33 people. That's what we know as of right now. And for the members, for the family members of the police department, if they have questions or
they need to contact us regarding their family members, they can call 718-677-8238. It's the Special Operations Division, and we'll be able to help them as much as possible.
How close are rescue teams able to get to the scene, assuming there are people who are there?
The rescue teams are able to get very close now. It was very difficult during the day, but in most places they now can operate. There's still a few dangerous areas, but they're able to operate. They're able to operate down there now.
And are there pockets where people maybe?
Yes, we're very hopeful that there are pockets where there are people, not only the ones that we know about, but hopefully others. A group of firefighters were at St. Vincent's Hospital that were in a void for 4 or 5 hours, and we're hopeful that there are other situations like that. And that's why our rescue workers are working so furiously.
How big a group was that, Mayor?
That was a company. It was a group.
Company survived?
No, it was about 7.
Yeah, it's 5 guys and an officer.
5 guys
6.
survived.
Yeah, 6 men.
This was earlier today. They were in I believe one World Trade Center, and the firefighter described to me that they were there for about 4 or 5 hours, and when they walked out, they were shocked to see that the building had come down, because they knew there had been damage, but they had been in a void, so they had been protected.
What unit are we talking about, Bill?
I'm not sure.
Forget.
We'll find out for you.
I think I remember, but I don't know.
Can you just tell us again about the 2 Port Authority police officers, how they were found, their condition?
No, the only thing we know is that they were found a while ago, that they're alive, and we'll get you more information about their condition.
And since we're talking about the Port Authority, I guess it's a reasonable assumption there's a large number of Port Authority police officers missing as well?
I'm sure there are. We don't have those exact numbers, as well as Port Authority personnel, people who work for the Port Authority.
Wasn't their office in?
Yeah, their office was there, and so we don't know how many people were actually at work. The first attack was at about 8:50, and then there was time to evacuate a lot of the building. So we're not sure at this point how much of the 2 buildings were evacuated in that period of time between the first attack by the airplane until the first building came down. We're hopeful, because we saw a lot of people leaving. We all did at the time we were down there. We're hopeful that a lot of people got out of the building, but we don't know the numbers yet.
Maybe Commissioner Carrick could tell us a little bit about the high-ranking members of the department. I understand one was missing for a while, and you were able to find him. And I believe the police surgeon was medevaced out to New Jersey. Did I get that right? No?
No, not to my knowledge. Police surgeons accounted for the ranks that we're looking at and looking for are at the ranks of police officer and detectives, and perhaps a few sergeants.
Last question, Deborah Farrell. Last one, Deborah Farrell.
That's all right.
Is there a coordinated effort right now to find out who exactly may have not been in the building when this happened, or people just calling various companies? How will we find out who was there and who was not there when this happened?
We're trying very hard by communicating with the Port Authority and some of the major tenants. We're trying to recreate how many people are there, but actually the major effort is really focused on trying to rescue people. The people who are out, I'm sure, have largely communicated with their families and are doing that. I saw many people doing that on the telephone as we were leaving. So really the focus of our efforts is to try to get as many people out as possible, with the hope that there are still people that are alive, like the ones that we know about.
Mayor, you said earlier that there were several other buildings downtown that may be structurally unsafe.
Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, with assistance from the police department and the fire department, in a news conference in which one of the leaders of the fire department union and fire department official, sorts at least, indicated that there are 300 New York City firemen missing. And the police department spokesman said that the number of New York City policemen missing is in the 30s. So 30 some odd New York City policemen missing. That doesn't mean that they're all dead or injured, but it means that they are missing and unaccounted for, and 300 New York City firemen missing at this hour. As for others dead and missing, the exact numbers unknown, although Mayor Giuliani has been saying throughout the day that we should be prepared for that number to be very large. And President Bush said in his address earlier this evening that thousands, I quote him, thousands are dead as a result of the attacks today. The attacks centered at the World Trade Center, this being a live picture past the Empire State Building on down to Lower Manhattan, where some flames and a lot of smoke still dominate the scene as rescue workers dig for people that the mayor said are known to be alive or were fairly recently known to be alive in the rubble. But it's no small job of going through with pickaxes and shovels and not to mention bulldozers and cranes trying to get to those people who may still be alive. A grim scene, to say the least, down in that part of Manhattan. Then there is the question in Washington of how many people died at the Defense Department of the Pentagon when it came under its own attack as another hijacked plane slammed into the nerve center of the American military. David Martin reports about that.
Dan, rescue workers believe that there are no survivors left in the building. They got about 60 people that they were able to account for at area hospitals. They believe as many as 850 people worked in that part of the building. So that is the basis for some of these estimates that as many as 800 died. But when you look at these close-up pictures of the damage, it's very, very clear that it's going to take a long, long time to go through all of this wreckage. So that estimate of 800 is nothing like a real body count of people's remains found inside that building. The number of casualties remains very unclear. Work is going to continue throughout the night searching for them. But we're not going to have a final count here, I would imagine, for a couple of days.
Well, that's important, David Martin, in that the Reuters news agency reported earlier in the evening, and we passed it along, quoting Reuters as saying that 800 had died. Apparently what happened is Reuters picked that up from another source, which we'll put in the skeptical or shaky category. But what you're saying now, we want to underscore it so there's no confusion. We've been saying right along there may be 100 to 800, but these are estimates of the number of people possibly killed in the Pentagon, correct?
Right, Dan. The exact number is just not known at this time.
And may not be known for quite some time.
Judging by those pictures, it's going to take a lot of heavy equipment to move all of those tons and tons of concrete to get in there and find people who were on the, say, the first or second floor and who are now trapped underneath the 2 or 3 floors that collapsed on top of them.
David Martin, thanks. President Bush has vowed to, quote, hunt down and punish those responsible for the attacks, and there are already said to be indications of who may have been behind them. For more on that, we turn to Jim Stewart in Washington. Jim, sort out the reports for us.
Well, Dan, congressmen are starting to be briefed early this evening by Justice Department and law enforcement officials, and they are telling some incredible tales that seem to be based on eyewitness accounts in the planes before they crashed. They are being told, for example, that in some aircraft there were 3 to 5 terrorists who came in and took the passengers hostage. Apparently, some of the passengers were herded into the back of the planes. These are according now to briefings that have been given congressmen. They're not confirmed yet, but apparently passengers were herded into the back of the planes. Passengers as well as crew members may have suffered from some knife wounds. And much of this information, Dan, appears to be coming now from phone calls that were made by passengers on these aircraft. Bob Orr has reported earlier that some of these planes were in the air for more than an hour. And many people use that opportunity to call loved ones and tell them of their plight. Some called 911, literally, and provided information about the seat number of the suspected terrorist, where they'd been sitting and what they looked like. We are led to believe, too, that some of the passengers may have provided such detail that law enforcement are speculating, because they've heard it from calls that were made from 2 separate aircraft, that the weapons may have all been closely identical and resembled what is known as a box knife. Dan, that's used to cut open cartons. The blade retracts in a metal folder that can go into a toilet kit or bag that you would use in the overhead luggage section. That would not normally be stopped at an airport. In fact, it would be legal in some airports overseas and is rarely checked here. Once you're then in the air, you can reach up, take your luggage down, and you have a weapon that could be put to use. And if, in fact, there were 3 to 5 people involved here, that would seem to be a plausible explanation. As to who did this, that story has not changed. The CIA and other intelligence officials have been saying consistently they have information, apparently some communications intercepts that points directly to Osama bin Laden. Right now, the FBI is going through the manifest of all the passengers on these planes. Some names have been picked out. We are told that search warrants have been executed in Davie, Florida. That's outside of Miami. It's unclear what that's going to turn up to. And finally, Dan, I would say I don't have any confirmation of this arrest in New York about explosives near the George Washington Bridge. To my knowledge, there have been no arrest of anyone involved in these attacks thus far, but we're continuing to look into that. Dan.
I appreciate your mentioning of that, Jim Stewart. And Marcia Kramer of WCBS TV, our CBS owned and operated station in New York, reported some time ago that the FBI had in custody 2 suspects caught with a pickup truck with explosives around the George Washington Bridge. Now, further checking on that story, that other law enforcement officials in New York said they knew nothing about it, and now Jim Stewart is saying that FBI headquarters in Washington knows nothing about it. We'll have to put that in a long line of things that's under the, well, we're skeptical now, maybe it's true and maybe it isn't. I repeat for emphasis, we'd rather be last than be wrong. But in reporting of this kind, we're bound to make some mistakes. I'm not saying this is a mistake. We must move it to the maybe category now, given the denials that are coming from law enforcement officials about the allegedly, supposedly, and reportedly arrest of 2 people with a pickup truck explosives around the George Washington Bridge over the Hudson River between New Jersey and New York. You know, it took 7 years to build the Twin Towers at the World Trade Center. It took just minutes for terrorists to bring them down. This is the way it happened this morning, between 9 and about 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. One of the Trade Center Twin Towers has already been hit by a plane, and then came this aircraft, which punctured through almost completely through the building, a massive ball of flame out the other side. Now each of the Twin Towers has been hit by a hijacked commercial airliner. And then there was witnesses begin to say part of one of the towers is collapsing. There was a hope and a prayer it would be only part of the building, but that was not to be. The entire building came down. Then, incredibly, almost inconceivably, a short while later, there were sounds, rumbles in the second of the Twin Towers, and then this. Sounded like a huge avalanche. You heard that sort of whoosh thunder. And the great avenues and the side streets filled with near suffocating smoke. And flames shot up behind it. Some firemen, some policemen, and it's believed many other citizens trapped in the debris and carnage that followed. Mika Brzezinski is in the area tonight. Mika?
Dan, I was back down at the scene where it is extremely slow going for thousands of rescuers, doctors, cops, and firefighters who are realizing by the hour just how massive this catastrophe really is. And these are people who have lost many of their own, and they are trying hard not to lose hope. By nightfall, the mayor of New York City made his way to the scene to assess the damage and boost morale. Heavy hitters and heavy equipment have been hauled in to help. Where the Twin Towers used to be, a slow, confusing search for life is underway.
They're going to be working all night on the rubble, trying to find body recovery, trying to find people that are still alive underneath everything.
It's going to be hectic. Go see the lieutenant right there.
Oh,
dump trucks are around the corner ready to rock and roll. We need transportation to get down.
It is a frustrating maze for people who care, trying to get to survivors like this doctor who rushed from a hospital across town to lend a hand.
Rescue teams are having a hard time getting in the rubble because of danger to the rescue teams themselves. So many firefighters were lost already when the buildings collapsed, and they're doing the best that they can, but I think it's just very difficult to get in there.
The city has come out by the numbers. Doctors, EMTs, and nurses have rushed to triage scenes, hoping to tend to survivors. It is not for lack of resources. It is just a matter of trying to coordinate such a massive disaster scene.
Just saw a lot of bodies laying around and destruction, and it's just hard to fathom. And you're right, there is no training for this type of thing.
For many here, it is clear this scene will take weeks to sort out, and exhaustion is setting in. Exhaustion for sure, but everyone we spoke to at the scene still had hope that maybe somewhere in there, underneath where the Twin Towers stood, there is some small pocket of life that can be saved. But of course, Dan, it is a race against time, and the scene is far too dangerous for a full-scale probe for life. Dan.
Mika Brzezinski, live on the scene. There are approximately 16,000 members of the New York City Fire Department. 300 New York City firemen are reported missing tonight. There are about 40,000 plus, all told, police. That includes transportation police in New York City. 30 some odd police officers are missing tonight. There are untold numbers of other citizens and rescue workers missing in the remains of the New York City World Trade Area. Fuad Ajami, professor at Johns Hopkins University, our CBS News consultant. If it is ascertained that Osama bin Laden had anything to do with this, truthfully, candidly, can the United States count on anybody in the region to help get him?
Well, Dan, I think there is the burden of not knowing, but then there is also the burden of knowing. When we finally established that it was actually Osama bin Laden, and we know that Osama bin Laden is a guest of the Taliban, I think the pressure on administration made of essentially people, Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, my own former dean, Paul Wolfowitz, was Deputy Secretary of Defense, they came into office swearing that the humiliation of American power during the Clinton year has come to an end. The pressure on them will be, in effect, to take it to the Taliban and to take it to Osama bin Laden. And the president himself made no secret of this. He said those who harbor terrorists will be just as accountable as the terrorists themselves. So we will have to go it, but we will probably go it alone.
Probably have to go it alone, not an unusual circumstance. And the talk that Saddam Hussein, he celebrated today, called it a great day, the greatest day of the century or some such thing.
Yes.
Should it be determined that Saddam Hussein helped in any way with this, the United States military is not today what it was at the time of Desert Storm.
But I think, again, this administration is sworn. I mean, there is a wing of the administration which actually believes in rollback in Iraq, not in containment. They believe that the containment of Saddam was a mistake. And they believe that they should now actually finish the job that they didn't do a decade ago. So there will be pressure on them. If indeed it's Saddam, triggered by the fact that they've been talking about unseating Saddam Hussein and trying him for crimes of war, then again, the same logic, we will have to go to the source. Either we go to the source in Afghanistan, if it's bin Laden and the Taliban, or we will have to go to the source in Baghdad if it's indeed Saddam Hussein who got himself involved in this.
Now, we had a coalition of nations, including a number of Arab nations, against Saddam Hussein the last time. What are the chances we could put together any kind of similar coalition?
That posse, which we will have to assemble this time around, will not have any Arabs. I mean, there are some people in the region who have no love lost for the Taliban. As we were just watching, President Khatami of Iran condemned the bin Laden and condemned this business in New York and in Washington. So it's not that either bin Laden or the Taliban are beloved in the region, but again, we are the white sahib who comes from far away. And people have these doubts about American power. And they have the doubts that at the end of the day, even after we arrive and we punish someone, that we will actually take them out, that we will just blow in and out of the region and they will be left with the carnage and they will be left with the debris. We are outsiders Nothing is going to change that fundamental fact. And when we go to do law and order operation or to put out fire, or when we launch a posse into that world, we always come as outsiders. It's the fate of this kind of power to be thus.
Fuad Ajami.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we want to go back to Washington very quickly, where CBS News correspondent Bob Orr has an update on the quadruple hijackings today. Bob, very briefly.
Well, Dan, what's really clearly emerging here is this was a coordinated attack. We know from the radar data now that all 4 of these planes took off within 35 to 40 minutes of one another from very busy East Coast cities. These cities were probably picked because at that morning rush hour, it's quite easy to thwart security, especially if you're using the knives, which we now hear these hijackers apparently used. The metal detectors and the X-ray machines are not designed to pick up things like knives, box cutters, as Jim Stewart described them, or possibly knives made out of even plastic. So it seems that whoever planned this did it at a busy place, 3 busy airports, at the very busiest time. It was very well orchestrated, and we now know the horrific details from the radar that some of these planes were in the air, 2 of them, in fact, more than an hour, and all of them more than 40 minutes. So one can only imagine the horror that must have been going on board. The cell phones tell part of the story. Perhaps the cockpit tapes, Dan, if and when they find them, will tell us a lot more.
Bob Orr, reporting again live from Washington. It has been throughout this day. Now, Pennsylvania was also touched by today's events. There in Somerset County, some 80 miles from Pittsburgh, United Airlines Flight 93 went down. It was supposed to fly from Newark to San Francisco. Steve Hartman has that part of the story.
This may be the hijacking that did not go as planned. This morning, United Flight 93 crashed in a cornfield 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh, killing all 45 people aboard. The plane was en route from Newark to San Francisco when somewhere near Cleveland, it made a sharp left turn and started heading, at least in the direction of Washington, D.C. Authorities can only speculate as to what may have been the intended target. Investigators say the plane crashed at a very steep angle, leaving a gaping hole in the ground, but only tiny pieces of airplane. Shortly before the crash, a 911 operator outside of Pittsburgh got a call from a man who had locked himself in the bathroom of the plane. He told the operator the plane had been hijacked and stayed on the line for at least 1 minute. Then, authorities say, the line went dead, probably before the plane crashed. That tape is now in the hands of the FBI, because whoever that man was, he may be their only witness.
Steve Hartman covering for us in southwestern Pennsylvania. Now, catastrophe, and that's the apt word. Yes, sometimes it's overused by reporters such as myself, and on occasion literally by myself, but it's an appropriate word. A catastrophe of this size and scope is unprecedented for New York City. This city's hospitals were quite simply overwhelmed. Bill Lagatuda has a report for you now on how the city is coping with trying to save so many lives.
Move out of the way! Let's go! Come on!
A New York City policeman overcome, stunned by what he's been through. He becomes one of the walking wounded and is helped to an ambulance.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
Firemen, dazed and bloody, also stunned by what they've just witnessed.
Horrible. It's like hell.
You don't want to know.
The whole building just collapsed.
As this firefighter made his way across the moonscape that Lower Manhattan had become, it was clear the number of dead and wounded would not be known for many hours.
No idea how many people and cops are dead. We have many people hurt.
What about the casualties? What have you seen?
Uncountable.
Every healthcare worker in the city knew the drill. At St. Vincent's Hospital, hundreds of doctors and nurses reported for duty and were outside waiting. So were the priests in their customary black and white, but with protective gloves. And then it began. The stream of ambulances would be nonstop. This was the city's closest trauma unit. Chief Surgeon Jesse Blumenthal.
We're yet anticipating many other casualties. We've heard from the scene. Actually, we sent some of our people down, and many individuals are trapped. So I think that many more are to come, probably severe crush injuries that are trapped by the rubble, not only the initial burning, but secondary rubble as the building collapsed.
By late in the day, St. Vincent's and other hospitals in the city were treating more than 600 wounded people, high by the standards of any disaster. But for this, fact was, everyone knew this would just be the beginning. Most of the victims so far were people outside the blown-up buildings, suffering from smoke inhalation, broken bones, burns, and shock. Yet to come, those trapped in the debris. This man was led to rescue by a fireman.
The concourse went totally dark. I heard a fireman yelling, "I'm over here. It's the door. I'm over here." I basically got on all fours and I just crawled to the door, hoping that I was crawling the right way and hoping that I was trying to follow the trail of the voice and crawl to the door.
At the moment, what was needed was blood. The city already had a shortage, and now the need was critical. Within an hour, New Yorkers lined up down city blocks to donate.
So I'm here just to donate some blood because I feel I'm doing something.
Frustrated Americans, angry, wanting to do something.
I think everyone in these lines feels citywide there's a great camaraderie and brotherhood in the city, and everyone's doing what they can, and what we can do to help is to give blood. Most of us have no other option, so that's why we're here.
Back at the World Trade Center, what was left of it, many firefighters and policemen were said to be missing, caught in the second attack while helping those wounded in the first. Lungs and eyes filled with smoke, hands bloodied from digging through debris, firemen saving people and each other. And again, the numbers, bearing in mind these are extremely preliminary, and they come from New York's Mayor Rudolph Giuliani tonight. 2,100 wounded, 600 of those are in hospitals. Dan, the next few days will tell the tale as the diggers work through the rubble and pull out either people alive or the bodies.
Indeed, and Mayor Giuliani has been emphasizing these are the early preliminary figures. Inevitably will be going up in the succeeding hours and days. Bill Lagattuta, thanks. Earlier tonight, President Bush, facing the most serious crisis of his presidency by far, addressed the American people on television from the Oval Office in Washington. Here now in its entirety is that presidential address.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight, I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you. Good night, and God bless America.
President George Bush speaking from the Oval Office in the White House. That was the president's address to the nation and the world tonight in its entirety on videotape. Bob Schieffer, our chief Washington correspondent, is in Washington. Bob, what a day this has been.
You know, I was thinking about it, Dan, and I think back, I can't remember a day quite like this. Perhaps the only day that in any way is like this, and you were there too in Dallas on the day that John Kennedy was shot. And you remember the uncertainty, first the shock of it. No one could believe it had happened. Then we didn't know what was behind it. You'll remember they closed the borders to Mexico. We didn't know what happened. That turned out to be, of course, the act of a madman. We don't know who is behind this attack, but while it kind of took the air out of this city, it seemed to me, in the beginning, Dan, as the day wore on, we began to see kind of this national resolve form as first one leader from one party and then another would come forward to say, we need to find out who's behind this. We support the president. This is a country that's going to speak with one voice. I don't know who caused this, Dan. I don't know who's behind this, but I think they made a monstrous mistake. If they thought that they were trying to get the attention of the American people, I believe they have done that, and I think they will rue the day that they did.
Bob, there's been so much talk, there always is in recent years, every time something even approaching this, and there's been nothing in this category really, the name of Osama bin Laden comes up, and in many ways there's been sort of a rush, a momentum in the direction of Osama bin Laden. You talk to people in Congress, in the Senate, in the House, and you have today. How far along is that? Is there any real empirical evidence that Osama bin Laden has done this? Where do we stand with all of that?
Well, I think where it is, Dan, is that what has happened today sort of follows the parallels of some of the things that he has done in the past. But from what I've been able to find out, the people in Congress who have been talking to our intelligence officials have not been able to get them to say definitely that is who they think it is. I think that they really don't know at this point who is behind all of this. And I'll tell you another thing. I think the first thing that's going to happen, I think you're going to see this government come together to find out who did this. Once that is determined, I think there will be retaliation. But after that, I think step 3 is going to be, why is it that we keep having these failures of intelligence? The ranking Republican on the Intelligence Committee, Senator Richard Shelby, told me tonight, he said, we had the bombing of the USS Cole. We had the bombing of those embassies in Africa. He said it's just one thing after another. He said, I don't know what's wrong, but we've got to do better than this. So I think somebody is going to have to come up with some answers pretty soon about why we continue to have these intelligence failures.
Bob, there is, of course, on the other side of that particular point, some of the intelligence community believe they're being scapegoated, because it is true with anybody's intelligence operations. It's one thing to gather intelligence, it's another to sort through it and, if you will, edit it properly, and then somebody in the White House and in the Justice Department, the Defense Department has to be listening. But all of that unquestionably will be coming to the fore, those kinds of questions, in the days, weeks, and months ahead. Let's go to our, sorry, Bob, go ahead.
I was just going to add on to what you say, because I totally agree with what you're saying. I mean, all too often, the only time we hear about our intelligence agencies is when there is a failure. We don't hear about their successes. But having said that, there's just great uncertainty about all this, Dan, up on Capitol Hill, about why these things continue to happen. Some of that is just obviously just frustration, but I think there are going to be many, many questions that are going to be asked, and in many cases, I think that should be asked.
Let's go to our chief White House correspondent, John Roberts, now. John, President Bush started a day in Florida, said he was coming back to Washington, got diverted to Louisiana as a special precautionary move, then went up to Nebraska as a further precaution. But is spending the night tonight in the White House, and at last report, he was meeting with some of his principal advisors about what to do next. Is that meeting still underway or finished by now?
Well, Dan, almost immediately after finishing his Oval Office address, the president went down into the Situation Room and gathered together his National Security Council and had a meeting with them that would include his National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State Colin Powell, who had just returned from South America in time for the Oval Office address, by the way, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, and a number of different aides. They talked about the day, they talked about the
Attack on America. Dan Rather reporting from CBS News World Headquarters in New York. It is 6 p.m. in the east, and a New York City Police Department spokesman says the remaining floors of the South Tower of the World Trade Center and 2 neighboring structures have collapsed within the last few minutes. We'll have more a little later on.
About the collapse of these buildings.
This live picture that you see is taken from one direction and up high, shows the smoke and fog. Some of this left over from yesterday, some of it caused by the continuing building collapses of this afternoon. The death toll has risen today, but slowly, as it's very tedious work down there trying to clear away some of the debris. You're watching CBS News continuing coverage of Attack on America. What is going on? Dan Rather reporting from CBS News World Headquarters in New York. It is 6 p.m. in the Eastern Time Zone now, and a New York City Police Department spokesman has said that the remaining floors of the South Tower of the World Trade Center and 2 neighboring structures have collapsed within the last few minutes. Byron Pitts is on the scene live. Byron?
Well, Dan, an update to what we reported a few minutes ago when we were told to move back immediately by police. What had happened was that high school behind me, there was a report of concern that there was a gas leak and there might well be a gas explosion. As the detective explained it to me, if there was a gas explosion in that building, we'd all be in serious trouble. Dan, as for the buildings that have collapsed, we have gotten double confirmation now that yes, the last few floors of the South Tower collapsed. We've been told there has been at least partial collapse
by the White House and by the Justice Department and the FBI to have been among the skyjackers' targets. According to top administration officials, there is, quote, real and credible evidence that the plane that hit the Pentagon, quote, was originally intended to hit the White House. Why it wound up hitting the Pentagon instead, no explanation has been given. Attorney General John Ashcroft says 3 to 6 hijackers armed with knives and box cutters at least took over each plane, 3 to 6. Some of the hijackers had been trained as pilots here in the United States. The Attorney General says the United States has developed what he calls, quote, numerous credible leads in the investigation of who's responsible. Other developments on this hour. The New York Stock Exchange now says it will not go back into business until Friday at the earliest. Their assurances it'll be Monday at the latest for the markets. The government says it is not yet ready to resume full air operations. The flight ban still stands, with some few limited exceptions. And the confirmed death toll in Lower Manhattan now has risen to an official 55, but it's still expected that many, many more bodies will be found as the days and weeks go by. Let's check in with CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent Bob Schieffer. Bob?
Good afternoon, Dan. Well, things are starting to settle down here a little. This was a very subdued place during most of the day, Dan. You know, yesterday, shortly after those planes hit the Twin Towers, police went through the Capitol here and told people to evacuate because another plane might be headed this way. People literally ran out of the Capitol building in terror. And who could blame them? They had seen these awful pictures on television. They thought the same was about to happen here. People are convinced here that that plane that crashed in Pittsburgh might have been heading their way. So you don't forget a day like that, even though it didn't turn out that way. People were really kind of apprehensive as they came back to work here this morning. There was extraordinary security in effect, which reminded people that the danger simply had not passed. So it was a strange and eerie kind of day at the Capitol here today. Now, the Congress passed a very strong resolution supporting the president, calling on him, and said they'd be behind him in tracking down and giving the appropriate punishment to whoever is behind this. The general feeling up here, Dan, it's not unanimous by any stretch of the imagination, but from what the senators and congressmen are getting from intelligence briefings is they seem to believe that it is pointing more and more toward Osama bin Laden. Now, I want to stress this is not a unanimous view, but many senators tell me they think that is the way this investigation is headed. There is almost unanimity in that the United States must take very strong action. In the words of John McCain, we must break the back of terrorism. John McCain, as you know, Dan, has a very good way of putting a point on things. I want to just read you what he said. He said, "I say this to our enemies, we are coming. God may show you mercy, we will not." I would say that that pretty much expresses the general view here at the Capitol tonight, Dan.
Bob, as you speak, we have a headline under you that says Rumsfeld, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld, criticizes those who leak classified information. I did hear the briefing, but of course we're distracted by many things. What's that all about? I think many people would read that and sort of scratch their head and say, what does that really mean?
Well, you mean what is Rumsfeld talking about?
Yes, with a criticizing, quote, those who release classified information.
I'm not sure what Secretary Rumsfeld is talking about on that one, Dan. I got in just on the tail end of the briefing that the Secretary was giving. I heard him say those words, and then I heard him leave, but I didn't understand what he was referring to when he said that. Certainly, when intelligence agencies come to Capitol Hill and brief the entire Congress or the entire Senate, I think they pretty well expect that they may call that information confidential and so forth, but you don't call 500 people into a room and not expect somebody to talk about it. So I'm not sure he's talking about the Congress when he says that. Maybe he was. I'm just not informed on that.
Well, is there not still a bill floating around in Congress that would make it a crime for anyone to receive classified information? Could it conceivably be anything about that?
It may be, but again, I say I'm just simply not informed on that. I'll tell you one of the questions that's being raised up here, when Ari Fleischer announced that there was credible evidence that there was a threat against Air Force One, several senators said to me, why would they tell that?
Well, why would they tell that?
And I have no idea. I have no idea, and I suppose that Ari Fleischer had his reasons, but maybe we can get John Roberts or Bill Plant to check on that. I don't understand why they told that one either, to be quite frank.
Well, there certainly is the possibility that when you start talking about how the U.S. government knows some of these things about Osama bin Laden or terrorist groups, we know, and we're not going to be guilty of explaining in detail on the air for fear that big ears that we don't want to hear it might hear it. But clearly the process of intercepting information There has been some talk on Capitol Hill and the press lately about how the U.S. government gathers that information, and it may be that the Defense Secretary and others are tender about that, and understandably so. But we'll just have to check that out. It seems a curious thing, and we'll need more information on it.
I was as curious as you were, Dan, and unfortunately I didn't have a chance to call the Pentagon myself.
Bob, let me move on to another subject. That obviously everybody's focus has been and remains on the rescue effort and trying to help the families of victims of these terrible, evil acts. But there has to be some concentration beginning to be given to what the effect of this is on the economy. A transportation emergency, the stock markets being closed tomorrow, maybe Friday as well. What are you hearing on Capitol Hill about that?
I think there's some real concern about that, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Dan, but has not one airline already announced that it's laying off
Yes, the Midway
people?
Airlines out of Chicago, they shut down, and in effect, 1,700 people like that were out of work.
And I would guess that's simply because of the cash flow that stops when they have to cancel all these flights during this emergency. So that shows you just the seriousness of this situation. I think the United States has to be very careful, and obviously we've all been talking about this all day, to keep this economy going, because a strong economy, as we have all learned over the years, is as much a part of a country's strength as its military weapons. There's no question about that. John McCain talked about during our interview earlier tonight, one of the reasons they've had to shut down the financial markets is because they're now so heavily dependent on telecommunications. So much of this money and so forth is moved around electronically. It's almost like when you go to buy an airline ticket, Dan, and we've all been to the counter one day when they say, "I'm sorry, the computers are down. We can't sell you an airline ticket." We've all had that experience. Well, in effect, the same thing I think happens sometimes with these big money transactions. Sometimes when the computers go down, you can't do anything, and we all understand the seriousness of that.
Bob Schieffer, our chief Washington correspondent, live on Capitol Hill. Let's go back to Byron Pitts in Lower Manhattan. We've had 4 either complete or partial building collapses reported over the last hour and a half. Byron?
Well, Dan, the headline of the moment, an ominous development. Earlier today, police rescue workers had heard gunshots coming from the debris of the 2 towers. Rescue workers had hoped initially that those gunshots might have been police officers buried at the bottom of the debris who were firing to let their colleagues know where they were. Word now is that's likely not the case. It was the sound of ammunition going off. That's what they heard. They now believe, though, it was just the belts worn by the police officers had melted under the heat of the flames, and their ammunition exploded, just went off on its own. What they hoped was an encouraging sign that some of their brothers and sisters might be okay. Turns out, Dan, at this moment, not to be the case. Dan?
Byron, and check me as we go here. We've had a portion of what little remained of one of the World Trade Center towers collapsing during the late afternoon. And then 3 buildings have had either partial or total collapse in the last hour and a half. 1 Liberty Plaza, the Millennium Hotel, and World Trade Center number 5. Does that match what you know from there?
Dan, that's rock solid as I understand it. Also, we've been told there is another building. Remember we talked earlier, there were 5 buildings altogether that were in jeopardy. That there is another building they believe that it's beginning to lean some. It's a 40-some story building. That building is beginning to lean some. There is some concern now at some point today, this evening, that building may collapse.
Byron Pitts in Lower Manhattan. We go to Bill Plant, one of our more experienced White House correspondents. Bill?
And the president at this hour is at the Pentagon visiting the rescue workers who are trying so valiantly to get survivors, they hope, and certainly the deceased out of the wreckage of the Pentagon. The president also would like to visit New York City, but realizes he can't do that. We're told at this stage of the game it would be simply too complicating at this early stage of the rescue. You know, Dan, you talked to Bob just a few minutes ago, Schieffer, about some of the questions raised by Secretary Rumsfeld. They think here at the White House that he wasn't talking about them, that he was talking about Congress. It reflects the frustration that many elected and appointed officials of the government have when they hear information that they think is classified that's put out. But that's a little disingenuous, as Bob pointed out, because you don't brief 500 people without expecting that the information will find its way to the top, as always happens in this town. At the same time, the White House itself put out some information today. They said that Air Force One was a target, that they had real and credible evidence of that. And I heard you and Bob ask, how do they know? And why would they say that? Well, there's one theory, Dan, about why they might say that. When Air Force One took off from Sarasota, Florida yesterday, it was right after the president had said that he was headed back to Washington. We know that about 20 minutes into its flight, it made a sharp turn, banked sharply to the left, and headed toward Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. Now, if the president's trip yesterday to Barksdale first and then to Offutt Air Base in Nebraska was simply because everybody was nervous but not based on any real facts, it might look as though he were running away. They certainly wouldn't want it to look like that. Some reporters are suggesting, and I am not necessarily endorsing this, that this was simply the story that Air Force One had been threatened was simply to justify the president's meanderings of yesterday. Now, who knows? That kind of stuff always floats around when you don't know, and it's always hard to judge any White House's intentions when they put out information, as you well know, Dan.
Well, and I also well know that in circumstances such as this, if there's any doubt, when there's any doubt, the president should be given the benefit of the doubt, and those working with him given the benefit of the doubt. I don't think those who are concocting such theories are going to get very far with them, which isn't to say to pass judgment on whether it may have some validity. But look, the White House says that there's credible evidence that the plane that hit the Pentagon was originally intended to hit the White House, says there's credible evidence to believe that Air Force One was a hoped-for target of the skyjackers, period. Next graph, that's what they say. There's no credible reason to believe it. One can think up all kinds of hypotheses, but I don't think very many people are going to have very much patience with that kind of thinking at the moment. There's too much serious work to be done, including, Ed Bradley, this situation in Lower Manhattan, which grows worse, not better by the hour, with the collapsing of 4 more buildings or parts of buildings, and as Byron Pitts points out, possibly even a 5th.
I think it makes it much more difficult for the search and rescue effort, because when there is a threat that these buildings are collapsed, they have to stop what they're doing and move back to a safe perimeter. So you still, if there is anyone else left alive, it makes it much more difficult.
We say if there is anyone else left alive, and it may be that hope is father to the thought, but in the Oklahoma City bombing, it was someone, I think, after 15 days following that bombing was found alive.
You know, listen, Dan, there's always hope, and I have hope that there is someone left alive. But the big difference between Oklahoma City and New York is that the Murrah building was 9 stories tall, and it was rather thin and spread out. It wasn't a huge building. The World Trade Centers towers were over 100 stories. And they just came down on top of each other. It was almost as if it imploded, one floor after another collapsing. So that anyone who was trapped in there is just going to have 100 floors of material coming down on top of them. It's hard to see how someone survives in that, unless they were in a basement area. For example, there's a train station in that area, unless they were in that area where there is an underground cavern. But if they were in any of those upper floors, it's hard to imagine how they could have survived that.
Or they got out before the building actually collapsed. But I have in mind, your point is well taken. Look, I'm an optimist and a hopeful person by experience and by nature, so I continue to believe they may find some additional people alive, as they did last night, in that debris. I have very much in mind that figure of some roughly 300 New York firemen, policemen, and other rescue workers who are known to be missing. Right. And, it's a reminder to take nothing away from the police, but particularly firemen. We take them for granted until they're needed. In every city and town in America, that's what happens. The police get some attention and get a lot of budget attention. The firemen always get the back end until you really need them.
This is the worst disaster in the history of New York. Over 200 firefighters are missing and unaccounted for. Over 200 of them.
Including some people, as the mayor and the fire chief and leaders pointed out last night, some of the most experienced. You're talking about people with 40 years service in the New York City Fire Department. Well, where does this go? It goes nowhere until we know their fate. But it puts an exclamation point behind what's happening down there when you realize so many people are missing, and the specter of those families who've been wandering from hospital to hospital today and trying to get anyone they could to talk to them and show a picture and say, here's a description, my wife, my daughter, my mother, my father, my uncle, hey, we haven't seen them, have you seen them?
Because there were people who did get out. The man you had yesterday came down 91 stories and led other people down and helped to carry some people down. So if you had time to go down 91 flights in that building, there was time to get a lot of people out.
There was overseas news today concerning the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and Mark Phillips, one of our most experienced foreign correspondents, has that and some other information for us at our CBS News London Bureau. Mark?
Well, Dan, as you say, the NATO alliance this afternoon invoked for the first time its Article 5. This is very important in terms of the idea of retaliation, of identifying the perpetrators of these attacks and coming up with some sort of appropriate, one presumes, military response to that. Article 5 of the NATO Charter is the one which declares it's the all-for-one, one-for-all charge, effectively, that an attack on any one country is taken to be an attack on all of the countries. NATO's council met, the North Atlantic Council met this afternoon in Brussels and invoked Article 5 for the first time in its history. There's been a lot of talk in Washington and, in fact, here in Europe of these attacks really constituting an act of war. Well, this is the NATO response to the act of war. Now, what does it mean? It means that NATO has effectively made all of its facilities available, and all of the participating NATO countries, military countries in Europe, make its facilities available for any military response that the United States might decide to take against whoever it decides to take that response. It doesn't necessarily mean, NATO is very anxious to point out, that any response will be a coordinated response involving one or more NATO countries, and it also doesn't mean that this in any way makes it necessary for the United States to consult with its NATO allies before doing anything, or in any way hamstring the United States in taking unilateral action. But what it does is prepare the foundations and the groundwork for any response the United States might decide to take. It's important to remember that that hasn't, the idea of supporting a U.S. response, in this case the presumption is, as was discussed just a little bit earlier, of accusations that Osama bin Laden, the Saudi dissident who's living in Afghanistan, that he is somehow responsible, or at least behind the funding or the organization of this act. Whether or not it's determined that that's in the direction that the response takes, we'll have to wait and see, of course. But in the past, there has been internal debate within NATO, or in the past when other culprits, particularly Colonel Gaddafi of Libya, have been singled out as requiring some sort of American military response. The reaction across NATO has not been universal. Planes would have had to have flown in that particular case all the way from Britain, whereas they could have more easily been flown from American bases or other NATO bases closer to where they had to go. In this case, all of that discussion has been gotten out of the way at this stage, even before any attack has been, we don't know, planned or certainly not launched. And that's a very, very significant development, at least on the diplomatic front here, Dan.
Mark Phillips, there's no very diplomatic or gentle way to say this, but in the coffee shops and among people hanging on the straps of crosstown buses, there's a sense and a lot of talk of, look, you can talk NATO, schmoto, but in the end, it's only the Brits who are going to be with us, really with us, whatever we do. Is that a view that's understood in Europe, whether it's valid or not?
Well, that's the significant difference this time around. In the past, yes, when when stuff happens, it's the Brits who tend to side, or have tended to side, primarily with the Americans. In this case, there's now a Brit, of course, at the head of NATO in Lord Robertson. In this case, it seems like the degree of seriousness, the severity of these attacks has so shocked and stunned the alliance that a decision was made to avoid all of the discussions that have necessarily happened in the past leading up to any American military response. Frankly, I don't know whether that means that any attack which is ultimately launched will have as its primary coordinating effect here, or coordinating forces here, where British planes and American planes might be involved if it turns out to be an air raid. But what it does is preempt any kind of discussion within NATO, any kind of crying and whining of the sort that we heard before as to the efficiency and even the wisdom of that kind of attack. And I will say that while there is a universal feeling here expressed by political leaders right across Europe and right across NATO of support and condolence and all of that for what's happened, and support for any potential American action, there are more and more voices being raised that very serious thought, the idea has to be given before any action is taken. The idea we just got to get out there and kill something or shoot something is understandable. But voices are also being raised here on the issue of the consequences of any American military action. You know, they've always said in terrorism, the terrorist modus vivendi has always been, well, you kill one person and you frighten 10,000. Now the stakes, the ante has been raised to the point where you kill 1,000 and frighten perhaps 1,000,000. But the reverse is true as well. You kill one terrorist, these days you might be creating 100 more. And of course we heard even from the Taliban regime in Afghanistan today the idea that the United States should think very seriously about attacking bin Laden interests there, for example, because that would merely raise hatreds within the area and within the Middle East. These are the arguments we're now hearing here. The NATO diplomatic argument, it appears, for this stage has been settled.
Mark Phillips in our Washington Bureau. Ed Bradley, before this series of terrible events happened, there was a general sense that the French and the Russians were, if not cozying up to the Iraqis and Saddam Hussein, they're actually going their own way. One wonders, it's one thing to talk about going after Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. In a way, that's a no-risk shot for the French and the Russians or anybody else. But if somebody talked about doing something to Saddam Hussein, that might create a different dynamic than what we're hearing out of NATO today.
And I think with both the French and the Russians, it's a matter of economics, because companies in France and in Russia are anxious to do business with Saddam Hussein. It's just a matter of money. And at the moment, no one's talking about Saddam Hussein as a target. I mean, people are talking about this may be state-sponsored terrorism, but no one has pointed a direct finger at Iraq and at Saddam Hussein. And I think that the overwhelming motivating force that has run politics in France and concern in Russia is simply pure economics. And I don't think that's likely to change.
Very quickly, in the moments we have left before we come to the half-hour break, and in some places the CBS Evening News, this business of our economy, I want to come back to, we had the chairman of the SEC here talking very steadily and confidently, saying every American should have full confidence in the financial markets and the economy. Obviously, this is the theme that they want to emphasize, but there are going to be an awful lot of people out there saying, well, that's what they say, but can I really believe that?
You know, I think that people will believe that in the rest of the country, and I think people in the rest of the country will be looking to see how New York reacts to this, because the losses in New York are large and small in a neighborhood where you have small stores that are closed. Not chain stores, but mom and pop stores, as we call them here, that are closed. That affects the people who own those small businesses. It affects the people who are not getting a paycheck, people who work there, because those stores are closed. And then there's the larger picture of industry. When you talk about Wall Street, look at the insurance business. They expect that insurance in the next year is going to cost $15 billion for the losses that we're seeing here. Losses in lives, losses in the buildings that went down, the World Trade Towers, in addition to the other buildings that went down, the planes that were crashed. You're talking about $15 billion in losses for the insurance companies. What are the insurance companies going to do to recoup some of that $15 billion? They're going to raise the rates on businesses worldwide to get some of that money back.
Ed Bradley, in Lower Manhattan at this hour, there have been 3 additional, at least partial, if not total, building collapses, and that follows behind an additional collapse of what remained of one of the World Trade Center main towers. And there's a report that a 5th building, if you take what remained of the World Trade Center tower, part of it collapsed, then 3 other buildings, and it's now an additional building that's wobbling and threatening to collapse. All of that happening in Lower Manhattan as we speak. You're watching continuing CBS News coverage of attack on America. The president declares this was an act of war.
The United States of America will use all our resources to conquer this enemy.
But who is the enemy?
Our government has credible evidence that the White House and Air Force One were targets.
Tonight, the latest on the hunt for clues and the desperate, heroic search for victims of the attack on America. The nation is stunned but standing this day after the attack and vowing to come back, fight back. Good evening again from CBS News headquarters in New York. Dan Rather with a special edition of the CBS Evening News, continuing coverage of the attack on America. It is not a declared war, but a war just the same. The word President Bush is now using to describe these suicide plane strikes on the World Trade Towers and the Pentagon. And the stakes could not be higher. A White House spokesman says intended targets included the White House and Air Force One. Read that, the President of the United States, since it is only Air Force One if he is aboard. The U.S. Justice Department says some of the skyjackers were trained as pilots in the United States. In an unprecedented move, NATO said terror attacks against the United States will be considered attacks against the entire alliance. And the stock market will be closed again tomorrow. It could be open Friday, they say Monday at the very latest. Here are some of today's other key developments. Rescue teams are working round the clock in the rubble of the World Trade Towers, risking their lives, trying to find victims of the disaster. President Bush said the attacks were not just acts of terror, they were acts of war. A war he vowed we will win. New polls indicate there is widespread American public support for retaliation. Congress reconvened today in a public show of unity to condemn the attack on the United States. Air travel was grounded for a 2nd day as airlines prepared to resume some flying under strict new security. The U.S. financial markets were closed again, but the United States and our allies vowed that these acts of terror will not destabilize the world economy. Federal investigators are following hundreds of leads tonight to try to find out who was behind the attacks and bring them to justice. Some aspects of the disaster go on. Take a look at this picture. Just a short time ago, another of the buildings damaged in the attack on the World Trade Center in downtown Manhattan finally surrendered in a kind of slow motion collapse. The building apparently was damaged by the collapse of the nearby Twin Towers. Also today, the last standing portion of the South Tower collapsed. Now to one of the headline stories of this day, the White House saying that President Bush apparently was an intended target of the terrorists. CBS's John Roberts is at the White House tonight. John?
Dan, as a further explanation as to why the president traveled all the way to Nebraska before heading back to Washington late yesterday, officials today revealed that they had a specific and credible threat against the president's life aboard Air Force One. And the president's press secretary went even further today, saying they have every reason to believe that the White House was a prime target of yesterday's massive terrorist attacks.
We have real and credible information that the airplane that landed at the Pentagon was originally intended to hit the White House.
White House officials would not disclose what evidence they had, but said today they believe the aircraft was streaking toward the president's home before terrorists suddenly circled back to hit the Pentagon. The threat against Air Force One was learned shortly after President Bush took off from Sarasota, Florida yesterday, intending to return to Washington. At that time, 9:55 a.m., United Airlines Flight 93, which eventually crashed near Pittsburgh, was still in the air. Press flying aboard Air Force One said what appeared to be an urgent return to Andrews Air Force Base suddenly changed.
Somewhere about 20 minutes into the flight, just as the Atlantic Ocean came into view off the right wing, we suddenly veered left, banked left, and started climbing in altitude, eventually leveling out at about 40,000 feet.
As Air Force One veered toward Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, word passed among security personnel on board that one hijacked aircraft still hadn't been accounted for. This afternoon, the strong suggestion from the White House that the target was Andrews Air Force Base the moment the president touched down.
It would be wise and in the interest of the country for Air Force One not to return to the location. That would have been predictable.
Now, late this afternoon, White House officials said that the president's strong language this morning that these were not just acts of terror, they were acts of war, had no bearing on the threat against his life. They said that attacks on American soil, such as the attack against the Pentagon, that the president toured late this afternoon, thanking the rescue workers who were involved in the search and rescue and salvage operations, such as the attack against the Pentagon. As for any declaration of war against those who might be responsible, the White House said late today that the president will work together with Congress to take the appropriate action at the appropriate time. Dan?
John, do most indicators, so far as you can make out, still point to Osama bin Laden, perhaps Osama bin Laden plus, but is the main focus in the investigation increasingly on bin Laden and Afghanistan or not?
Well, Dan, certainly no one is mentioning any other names but that of Osama bin Laden at this point, though sources still caution us that not all of that information is sewn together. They do not have a definite link. But, Dan, what you can certainly see in the president's language today, as well as the language of the Secretary of State, the White House does appear to be steeling the people of this nation for some sort of appropriate response at, again, what the president says will be the appropriate time.
John Roberts, thanks. It now appears some doomed passengers and crew aboard the hijacked planes may have made desperate efforts to save their lives and engaged in heroic acts against the skyjackers. CBS's Bob Orr has been collecting the astounding information coming out on this front and has some late details. Bob?
Well, Dan, tonight there is some new evidence that authorities were given a last-minute warning just before yesterday's attack. And as you mentioned, it may turn out the hostages on at least one of the planes tried to overpower their hijackers. But in the end, there was no way to stop the wholesale destruction.
Sources say shortly before American Airlines Flight 11 slammed into the World Trade Center, a crew member aboard the jetliner managed to phone the airline's operations center with a hijacking alert. In addition, the Christian Science Monitor reports one of the jet's pilots secretly keyed a cockpit microphone, allowing controllers to hear the terrorist threats. But there was no time to stop the attack and no way to keep the second jet, United Airlines Flight 175, from delivering the follow-up blast. There is new evidence hijackers made some effort to conceal that attack. As this Flight Explorer display demonstrates, crucial radar data suddenly dropped off controller screens as Flight 175 made its final turn over New Jersey. As it closed in on Manhattan, controllers had no way of knowing exactly where the plane was. Sources say that's because someone in the cockpit, presumably a hijacker familiar with cockpit controls, deliberately turned off the plane's transponder, the device that sends flight information to controllers. The transponder on American Flight 77 was also turned off before that jet crashed into the Pentagon. Radar tracked the 757 to the Ohio-Kentucky border, but information was lost as the plane turned and targeted Washington. Sources say the jet seemed to be on a track towards the White House, but suddenly headed for the Pentagon. CBS News consultant Mitch Mitchell was right there.
We watched it go in front of us at a distance of about 100 feet in front of us and about 20 feet over us. It appeared as if we were landing right on our roof. We looked, we watched it go into the Pentagon.
The fourth airplane did not hit its designated target, but crashed in rural Pennsylvania. At least one cell phone call from a passenger indicated there was a plan to take on the hijackers. And sources say there is some evidence of a fight for control just before the plane went down. Alice Hoagland also got a call from her son on that doomed plane. Mark Bingham told her of 3 hijackers claiming to have a bomb.
I asked him, Mark, who are these people? And he became distracted, didn't answer the question, and then we were cut off.
We're told 10 to 12 minutes after that phone call, that plane, United Flight 93, crashed. Investigators say they hope the flight recorders will tell them exactly what went on in that cockpit, but more importantly, perhaps, who was behind the well-orchestrated attack. Dan?
And on that score, Bob, FBI Director Robert Mueller today stressed there are 2 immediate goals: identify the hijackers, the killers, and any accomplices inside or outside the United States. CBS's Jim Stewart reports investigators already know a lot. Jim, what do they know?
Dan, as many as 24 terrorists armed with knives seized the hijacked aircraft, and federal authorities now say they know many of them by name, and that all of them learned how to fly commercial aircraft right here in the United States. Sources say the identities surfaced through a study of the passenger manifest from the doomed aircraft, plus communications intercepts picked up shortly after the attacks. And while the evidence is still in the early stages, sources say all of it still points like a compass to Osama bin Laden.
Attorney General John Ashcroft provided the first official details of what happened on board the planes.
The 4 planes were hijacked by between 3 and 6 individuals per plane, using knives and box cutters, and in some cases making bomb threats.
New FBI Director Bob Mueller said after identifying all the hijackers, his next step is to retrace their steps.
And we are attempting to recreate the travels of each of the hijackers on the planes, either the hijackers themselves or their associates.
Back up! And the search for those associates was in full fury today, with FBI SWAT teams storming a Boston hotel to search a room believed used by 1 or more of the hijackers. No one connected with the hijackings was arrested there or later when authorities stopped a train near Providence, Rhode Island. Officials were also focusing on 2 aviation schools in Florida and appeared to zero in on 2 recent Arab students. Residents say agents specifically asked about a man named Mohammed Atta and another named Marwan Yusuf Al-Shihi, both of whom had their commercial pilot multi-engine licenses recertified in June. Venice, Florida resident Charles Voss said he told agents he rented a room to the 2 men a year ago.
Well, they told me that that these 2 persons were involved, and it was believed that they were some of the individuals that had been involved in the takeover of the aircraft that went into the World Trade Center.
Elsewhere, agents conducted searches in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, Daytona, and Vero Beach, Florida, as well as along entry points at the Canadian border adjoining Maine, where 2 of the suspects may have entered the United States. And, of course, investigators were still collecting all the usual physical evidence.
Rental car receipts, telephone logs, videotape from parking garages, and pay telephone videotape records.
The clear assumption by federal lawmen is that these terrorists had help from accomplices who may still be in the United States. What is not as clear is whether those accomplices were only bit players in this historic assault, or whether they may still have still-to-be-launched terrorist plans of their own. Dan?
Jim, is it expected or not that there soon will be some arrests?
Dan, I do sense optimism in talking with federal authorities, but I have to tell you that if this does turn out to be Osama bin Laden, then we have been down this path before. First national outrage, then a flurry of search warrants and record gathering, followed by months of frustration. We can only hope that this one especially, turns out to be different. Dan?
Jim Stewart in Washington. Even as the fires from the attack on the Pentagon flared up and still burned today, planning was going forward for a possible military response against those behind the terror. CBS's David Martin is tracking both stories. David?
Dan, the Pentagon may not have been the primary target, but the plane certainly scored a direct hit. Defense Department officials say there are no more survivors. Anyone not killed by the impact perished in the flames. It now appears between 100 and 200 people died here, but not the 800 one official had estimated.
And we won't know for some time precise numbers, but from everything that we currently know the estimate that's been widely reported is considerably high.
Some of the 60 survivors are being treated for severe burns, and their relatives count them lucky to be alive.
I walked in there and I said, "I love you." She moved her head a little bit. I said, "Please wiggle your toes." Her toes wiggled, and that was the extent of our conversation. I was so ecstatic.
When the sun came up this morning, firefighters were still pouring water on the blaze started by the jet fuel.
We are still engaged in a very stubborn firefight with parts of the building.
The wife of an Army accountant who worked right where the plane hit could do nothing but keep a hopeless vigil.
Obviously the fire is still pretty much going, but it's still frustrating to see them just kind of looking at it and not going in.
By mid-afternoon, the smoke had finally cleared. Now it's the FBI's turn because the wreckage is considered a crime scene, although the force of the crash destroyed much of the evidence.
There are some small pieces of aircraft visible, but not large sections. In other words, there's no fuselage sections and that sort of thing.
Parts of the Pentagon are open, although heavily guarded, as are all U.S. military bases. Not knowing for sure if the attacks are over, the Pentagon has ordered fighters to patrol both the east and west coasts and is sending warships to both New York and Washington. But the most valuable ship may be the hospital ship Comfort. The investigation into who caused all this continues to point toward Osama bin Laden, and there's no doubt the U.S. will retaliate against whoever is responsible, as the Secretary of Defense made clear in an address to the troops.
The task of vanquishing these terrible enemies and in protecting the American people and the cause of human freedom will fall to you, the men and women in the Department of Defense.
The aircraft carrier Enterprise has been turned around and sent back to the Persian Gulf, giving the U.S. 2 carrier battle groups in the region. It's clear the Bush administration is planning for an all-out military campaign against terrorism.
I think anyone who thinks it's easy is wrong. I think that it will require a sustained and broadly based effort.
The European allies today invoked the clause of the NATO treaty, which states that an attack against one is an attack against all. The more allies the U.S. gathers up, the more military options it has.
We're building a strong coalition to go after these perpetrators, but more broadly, to go after terrorism wherever we find it in the world.
Osama bin Laden is believed to be hiding out in Afghanistan, which is why U.S. officials have begun talks with Pakistan, which shares a long border with Afghanistan. Dan?
David Martin at the Pentagon. In Afghanistan today, Osama bin Laden's Taliban protectors insisted again, but offered no evidence, that bin Laden had nothing to do with the attacks. At the same time, the Taliban made what could be interpreted as a threat, suggesting that U.S. military action that causes what they call suffering in Afghanistan might lead to more suicide attacks. While officials hold out no hope for finding survivors in the Pentagon attack, a massive effort is still underway here in New York. Workers are braving dust, danger, and more unstable buildings, trying to find thousands of missing people in the Trade Center rubble. CBS's Byron Pitts is at the scene tonight. Byron?
Well, Dan, here at Ground Zero, there has now been a shift in the mood and the wind. In the past half hour, the wind has turned north. That means the plumes of smoke over the disaster site that you see behind me are now headed in our direction. That gas is filled with dangerous gases and fibers. And for that reason, authorities have recommended that we wear these respirators for our own safety. Also, a few minutes ago, a firefighter came out and told us all that they no longer hear those tapping sounds coming from the debris. No more cell phone calls. No more radio messages from police officers and firefighters buried in the debris. Not a good sign on what has already been a very difficult day. Today, in the long shadow of Lady Liberty, as Air Force fighter jets patrol the skies over Manhattan, volunteers by the thousands sifted through metal and misery.
One of the officers came in and said they found a man at 6 in the morning and they had to cut his legs to get him out.
All reminders freedom in America has never been free.
I'm doing this because this is America, this is New York, and these people need people down there right now. I know if I was in there, they'd be in there trying to dig me out.
I was at Oklahoma City bombing the Murray building. This is like 20 of them all in one.
Rescuer and police officer Dan McDonough says he isn't simply looking for survivors or bodies. He, like so many others, is still looking for friends.
We're missing our whole company.
New York's fire chief, a senior chaplain, and head of the search and rescue team, all killed when a building collapsed. More than 200 fellow firefighters missing. Close to 30 New York City police officers unaccounted for. And there beneath 50 feet of twisted steel and crumpled concrete, beneath what were once the tallest towers in Manhattan, rest the remains of countless victims and the whispers of survivors still alive.
We were taking out someone on a stretcher.
They were alive.
And as he came down the line, I saw that his eyes were open and he was talking.
How good did that feel?
I'm almost ready to cry once again.
But there is not a single chance the living here will outnumber the dead.
The numbers that we're working on are in the thousands. Obviously, we hope that's not the case.
There are men and women lined up here who haven't slept much in the past 36 hours, running on adrenaline and running out of time. 8:48 a.m. Tuesday, that moment in time that changed lives and took lives.
Horrible. The whole building just collapsed on us.
Let me get you into Stuyvesant High School.
Nightmares. Armageddon right here.
I'm okay. It collapsed. The top floors collapsed down.
There was like a sonic boom and a firestorm above my head.
Kathy Capsuto ran from the World Trade Center with her daughters in her arms.
What do you tell your children after living through something like that?
You thank God that you're alive. And my kids know that their lives will never be the same again.
Never the same, but still New Yorkers tried. Blocks from the bombing, a father played ball with his son.
We're trying to make the kids adjust as much as possible without making them as afraid as the adults are.
That firefighter who came out and spoke with us a few minutes ago said that he, too, now is afraid. In the past hour, 3 more buildings collapsed, we've been told, around the disaster site. When that happened, the rescue workers were pulled out. That firefighter told us the longer he's unable to do his job, the less likely it becomes they will find more survivors. Dan, many people will pray tonight that firefighter is wrong.
Byron Pitts. The word came late today from Wall Street, only blocks from the lower Manhattan disaster site. The stock markets will be closed again tomorrow and possibly the rest of this week. CBS's business correspondent Anthony Mason tells us what this may mean. Anthony?
Dan, the bond market will reopen tomorrow, but concerned about the damage to infrastructure, much of Wall Street will not go back to business. The stock markets will remain closed for a 3rd straight day because, as the head of the SEC, Harvey Pitt, put it, we didn't want to promise something we couldn't deliver.
Drowned in debris, Wall Street was a deserted corridor again today. The head of the New York Stock Exchange could promise only that markets
will resume operations no later than Monday.
Dick Grasso said Wall Street still had concerns about the soundness of structures, access to buildings, and power supply.
The conduits that sit beneath the streets of lower Manhattan have been subjected to the equivalent of several mini earthquakes when those 2 towers came down.
Many major financial firms had their offices damaged or destroyed in the attack, but the damage to physical capital was only part of the story.
I worry a little bit more about the human capital, the expertise that was probably lost. You know, we can rebuild a building and install computer screens, but to train the kind of people who were probably lost there yesterday, that will take some time.
The investment firm Morgan Stanley had 3,500 employees in the World Trade Center. Today, on its Times Square ticker, instead of stock quotes, the company ran employee helpline numbers. CEO Philip Purcell said this morning the vast majority were safe.
It is not a good story, but we think it's going to be much less bad than it appeared during the day yesterday.
But in a broadcast to his employees, he appeared to choke up.
And we're going to be fine.
But will the U.S. economy be fine? World markets have been highly volatile in the aftermath of the attack, amid concerns about the country that has been the engine of the global economy.
I think there's a lot of caution amongst investors around the world now as they try to understand just how much the US public, how much that engine of growth could have been knocked off its track.
One encouraging sign, the European markets rebounded today, and the finance ministers and central bankers of the Group of 7 nations issued a joint statement vowing the global economy will not be disrupted. Dan?
Anthony, with all of the damage to the buildings and this scene down in Lower Manhattan, how can these companies reopen for business by even Monday?
One of the remarkable things is almost all of these major companies have entire duplicate systems, sometimes as far away as Virginia, across the river in New Jersey. There are secondary trading floors just sitting empty waiting for a crisis. They're just moving people to those places. All of your financial records, whichever company may have it, has a duplicate set somewhere else in the country. They can retrieve that information.
Anthony Mason, thanks. For the insurance industry, claims from the terror attack on the World Trade Center could reach a near record $15 billion. That would make it second only to the $20 billion insurance bill from 1992's Hurricane Andrew. Joining us now from Washington, the Majority Leader of the United States Senate, Democrat Tom Daschle of South Dakota. Mr. Leader, thank you for coming in tonight.
You're welcome, Dan.
True or untrue that your hope and the hope of your Republican counterparts is that you can pass a $20 billion appropriations bill to handle some of the cost of what's happening now by late tomorrow?
Well, Dan, I think it's premature to come to any conclusions about what the amount or how quickly the passage, but we certainly want to act as expeditiously as we can. We've been in close consultation with the White House and with our colleagues in the House of Representatives, and we'll do whatever it takes to be as helpful and as cooperative as possible.
What is the effect of this on our economy? We pull back what we call in television the wide shot. Yes, we're very much concerned about the families of victims and the search for what may remain of the living. But at some point we have to say, what's happening with our economy? Is this enough to tip us over into recession?
Well, I think your story just now reflects the tremendous devastation and the concern for the economy. We want to do all that we can to help stabilize it through policy and through our public pronunciations. But clearly we know we're in some very difficult times. We know that there is a good deal of uncertainty, whether we open the markets on Monday or sometime this week. We know that we've got our work cut out for us, and we also know that we have a responsibility to try to put as much confidence back into the economy and into the markets as we can.
As for the investigation into who is responsible for what's been happening, you've been briefed. What do you hear? What can you tell us?
Well, there's little that we can tell you beyond what has already been reported. We do know that the full force of all of our investigative agencies, all of our intelligence agencies are now being applied. We recognize that there is a good deal of work that needs to be done. We also recognize that there's a lot we probably won't know for some time to come, that we've got to collectively and very carefully put together the pieces so we have the best understanding of what the circumstances are that we could hope to have.
And a retaliation of some kind is likely to happen sooner as opposed to later, larger as opposed to smaller?
Well, I don't know that we want to put a timeline on it or a size on it. We know that we're going to do all that will be required to punish the perpetrators, to bring to justice those responsible, to retaliate wherever it is possible for us to do so with the confidence that we're retaliating in the right way. But clearly this is going to take additional fact gathering, additional intelligence, and far more effort to try to put a plan in place prior to the time we commit to that plan.
In Congress, is there generally satisfaction with our intelligence operations, despite the fact that there was no warning of these attacks?
Well, I'd say there is a general level of satisfaction. Clearly, these acts of terror cannot be predicted with any certainty. I think the intelligence gathering services of the federal government have done a good job. We know now, given the threat, given the circumstances, given what we now recognize as a new era, we're going to have to do a lot more. And we want to be supportive of efforts to do more as we look to what resources they may need.
Mr. Leader, let's turn to what is now the transportation emergency. What's your information on when the airlines will be back to anywhere near normal?
Well, I don't know when we'll be near normal. We are going to restart all of at least the commercial airline traffic tomorrow morning. That doesn't mean that things will be back the way they were even on Monday. We are going to go through a lot more security. We're going to have much more of a cautionary approach to the way in which our airlines are scheduled, but clearly the effort will begin tomorrow. There will be bumps, there will be a lot of glitches. We know that this isn't going to be smooth. We've got to brace ourselves for that, but it starts tomorrow.
Mr. Leader, is legislation being considered to make law enforcement in charge of the security at our airports?
Well, we're considering a lot of legislative options regarding Social Security, or regarding security, Dan, and that's one of them. What can we do to beef up security in ways that will give us more confidence? I think we've now seen a tremendous threat to air travel in ways that we never anticipated. We've got to recognize that that will require actions that we never anticipated, and we're contemplating just what those actions should be.
Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle, thank you.
My pleasure.
You are watching continuing CBS News coverage of the attack on America. Now, the situation in Lower Manhattan at the moment is the death toll continues to rise, but slowly, because the rescue and recovery efforts are being so hampered. This is CBS News, ongoing coverage of the attack on America. Back now at CBS News World Headquarters in New York, Dan Rather with more of our special coverage of the attack on America. Headlines of the hour: White House officials say there is, quote, credible evidence President Bush was an intended target of the terror attacks. Federal investigators have now identified many of the hijackers, they say. All took training in the U.S. to fly commercial aircraft. NATO has declared terror attacks against the U.S. will be considered attacks on all NATO nations. At Ground Zero in New York City, more damaged buildings crumble, hampering rescue efforts. Thousands still missing. Known confirmed dead, 55 in New York. The stock markets could reopen as soon as Friday. Now, other key developments of the day. Federal investigators are following up every lead in the hunt for those responsible for what President Bush calls acts of war. The U.S. military remains on high alert. The Navy has dispatched warships to New York waters to help with security and humanitarian operations. New York hospitals are still treating hundreds of victims. The heroes of this horror, hundreds of rescue workers, are risking their lives tonight in the rubble of the World Trade Towers, searching still for victims. New York's mayor today distributed pictures of flight recorders in the hope someone will find the recorders from the suicide planes. The FAA today did not reopen U.S. airspace, even on a limited basis. Regular air service remains banned indefinitely. And the U.S. and its allies vowed the terror attacks will not be allowed to disrupt the world economy. At first, the FAA ban on civilian aviation was to have been lifted at noon today Eastern Time. But as the day went on, it became increasingly clear that putting the nation's air transportation system back together again was going to be a much tougher proposition. Cynthia Bowers is at Chicago's O'Hare Airport.
The skies above one of the nation's busiest airports are eerily empty today. Some flights diverted yesterday were allowed to resume, but passengers arriving for newly scheduled flights were turned away, their planes grounded.
Well, we still are not leaving any passengers through.
But the building is still technically closed to everybody from the outside, so you have to leave.
If you want to know how tough it's going to be to get America fully flying again, you need look no further than Chicago's O'Hare, the hub of the nation's two largest airlines, both targeted in the attacks. Every day, more than 250,000 people move with their bags through concourse checkpoints. Any increase in security will only add to delays at an airport already notorious for them. And that's not the only problem.
Moving hundreds of airplanes to where they need to be, hundreds of crew members to where they need to be, and arranging where they're supposed to be at each given airport is going to be a grade school fire drill. It's going to be an absolute nightmare.
That's because yesterday morning, hundreds of planes were ordered to land at the first safe haven, no matter where that was. From Los Angeles to Green Bay, even Canada. Untangling this mess will take a lot longer than it took the government to clear the skies. According to the FAA, at 10 a.m. yesterday, just after the attack, 3,181 planes were in the air over America. Within 17 minutes, almost 1,000 of those had landed, and in just over an hour and a half, all of them were on the ground. An extraordinary feat of air traffic control that resulted in enormous disruptions at airports like O'Hare.
I guess I'll just have to sit here and see what happens.
This evening, Canada is reopening its airspace to release 240 diverted planes, but any of those flights bound for the U.S. will still require FAA clearance before they can get into this country. Stranded passengers here at home will also be allowed to get to their destinations, but the FAA has given no indication of when regular air travel will resume. Dan?
Cynthia Bowers in Chicago. When air travel does resume, travelers can expect to encounter far more stringent security measures than those they've been used to. Vince Gonzalez has more on past lapses and future safeguards.
The day before the terrorist attacks on New York and Washington, federal investigators fanned out across the country, examining the FAA's efforts to improve security at airport checkpoints. A review of government records reveals the checkpoints, generally manned by poorly trained, underpaid workers, are just one gaping hole in America's airport security system.
Our security is very, very sloppy, and it's not because the systems aren't there, it's because we don't use them. People aren't security aware.
CBS News has learned the two airlines involved in yesterday's terrorist attack have been repeatedly cited for security violations. In the last 6 months of 2000, American Airlines was fined more than $400,000 for 49 incidents. United Airlines was fined $356,000 for 38 incidents. Delta was even worse, more than $600,000. In July, the FAA proposed fining American an additional $99,000 for security violations at several airports, including Boston's Logan Airport, where two of yesterday's doomed flights originated. The American jet that crashed into the Pentagon took off from Dulles. As in many airports, security for that flight was contracted out to an outside company, in this case, Argon Bright Holdings. In May, the company was fined more than $1.5 million after investigators found they put poorly trained personnel at checkpoints in Philadelphia and even hired convicted drug dealers and kidnappers. Company officials refused to discuss the charges with CBS News. After a series of security breaches at Los Angeles International Airport, a reporter from KCBS TV went undercover in 1999.
Is security so loose that it's possible for a terrorist to get a weapon on an airplane? We found out it's not only possible, in some cases, it's easy.
Security staff failed to properly check passengers. A producer posing as a traveler in a wheelchair was pushed around metal detectors and not adequately inspected.
When a security checker misses an encapsulated pistol or some other test, you fire them. You don't retrain them. This is security. It's my life and yours.
Today, FAA officials told CBS News within the next few weeks they will take a much greater role in airport safety by directly regulating security companies, something they don't do now. Vince Gonzalez, CBS News, Los Angeles.
Energy Secretary Spencer Abraham warned today that the terror attacks do not justify gasoline price hikes reported across the country, and he urged consumers to report any gouging to officials. CBS's Bob McNamara tells us that many angry motorists paid more at the pump than they should have.
This Oklahoma City Texaco gave refunds today. Cash back to gouged customers after jacking up gas prices to $5 a gallon yesterday.
I got my money back, so I'm happy. I'm a little disappointed that they did it, though.
The station's owner said a supplier had led him to believe that fuel supplies would soon be scarce.
Well, a tragedy like this, we certainly don't want people to think that we're trying to make extra money.
Gas stations from Dallas to Detroit and Indianapolis in between had more lines than AT&T.
It seemed like I should get filled up if there's going to be a shortage for a few days.
It's going up to $5, and that's going to kill a whole lot of people's pockets.
The rush hour was fueled by false rumors of gas shortages and refinery shutdowns. People were filling everything from small gas cans to not one, but a pair of 40-gallon tanks.
With everything the way it is, I think it's time to go ahead and fill them up.
Service stations are selling anywhere from 4 to 6 times their normal daily volume yesterday. The system is not designed to handle that level of consumption
A rumor in Oklahoma would start a rush to the pump in Texas and Arkansas.
I'm the same guy griping about the people panicking, and here I am getting gas tonight and scared of what it's going to be like tomorrow.
A Houston station hiked prices 12 cents in about half an hour. Gas bought at $11.03 for $1.57, sold at $11.38 for $1.69.
No, we're not changing the price.
The attendant didn't want to talk about it. A station in suburban Kansas City, with a price of $5 a gallon, had customers waiting to be gouged for no reason.
This is terrorism in another form. Making people afraid we're going to run out of gas, making people afraid they won't be able to get to work.
While this Indianapolis station was drained dry today, oil industry analysts say gas supplies nationwide are ample for this time of year, and production is up.
Calm down. If you've got half a tank of gas, try to get by another couple of days. The situation will improve greatly, and you'll be able to buy gas at much more normal prices.
With some exceptions, gas prices haven't changed since the terror attacks, and several states have promised to prosecute those who won't bring their prices back closer to earth. Bob McNamara, CBS News, Dallas.
As the anguish and the anger rise in many quarters over the attack on America, one minority group lives with the growing fear that it is becoming an all-too-easy scapegoat. Maureen Maher has the Arab American perspective.
In Dallas, it's bullet holes and shattered windows from an overnight drive-by shooting at an Islamic center.
We're lucky nobody was here.
In Detroit, angry Americans threaten area businesses.
You all die of horrible diseases, horrible death.
Both clear signs that a backlash against the Arab American community has already begun. Today, as many of the 1 million Arab Americans follow the aftermath of Tuesday's tragedies, many are afraid.
We don't want to be blamed on it. We are all in it. We all suffering in it.
Across the country, mosques and Muslim schools are under tight security. From the Oklahoma City bombing to the attack on the Cole, in this country, acts of terrorism often extend the long arm of accusation across the entire Arab American community.
When bombing happened in Oklahoma, it wasn't Christian. You know, it was a certain individual that had a certain background, where with us, right away, it becomes a Muslim.
And that includes Christian Arabs like Mohammed Sayam.
You know, everybody looking at you as like maybe you are a suspect. But they don't know that we are citizens of America. We live here, we work here.
Today, as Muslims arrived for the call to prayer, in Dearborn, Michigan, where the largest portion of the Arab American population resides, community leaders are searching for ways to keep the peace. Until, as Osami Sablami, who publishes the Arab American News, says, the responsible party is found.
If Osama bin Laden had been proven that he is behind this atrocity, we would like our community, would like to be part of the armed forces, and I'm sure that there are Arab Americans and Muslim Americans in the armed forces, to go and get him and bring him to justice.
While the Arab community is outraged by scenes like this at this Islamic center behind me, late word today from the FBI that they are now looking to speak with another former suburban Dallas leader of another Islamic center does not bode well for Muslims anywhere across this country. The FBI says it is looking to speak with Mataz al-Halik. They do not say he is a suspect, only that they do want to question him in connection with yesterday's events. Dan?
Maureen Maher in Dallas. Joining us now from Washington is the Defense Secretary of the United States of America, Donald Rumsfeld. Mr. Secretary, thank you for your time tonight. You've called this a new kind of war. What do you mean?
Well, you know, normally there is a capital and a defined nation and a people that engages in a conflict that we call war. In this instance, it is quite different. It is a very different kind of warfare. It is indeed an attack on a way of life, because the purpose of terrorism is to terrorize. And to terrorize is to deny people their freedom to go about their daily lives and to provide for their families and to travel. And that's something that we cannot stand for, is a fundamental attack on the way of life in our country.
You said this afternoon the task of defeating these enemies will fall to the men and women of the U.S. Armed Forces. Do you mean that the way it sounds, that we're on the cusp now of launching a military campaign?
No, what I would say is this, that the effort against terrorism is going to require a broadly based and sustained effort over a good period of time. It is not something that's easily done. Anyone looking at the attack today can see that it was well organized, well financed, and vicious. So I think that it's important to recognize that it will be an effort that will be over a sustained period of time and will bring into play the full range of government capabilities.
Any doubt in your mind that Osama bin Laden was behind this?
My interest is in seeing that terrorism in its broadest sense is dealt with, and that we are capable of defending ourselves against that attack on our way of life. And it certainly is a broad problem that goes beyond any one country or any one non-state entity such as that.
That would suggest, and I would ask whether you intended to suggest, that some of this attack may be tied to state-sponsored terrorism.
There's no question but that terrorism can be tied both to state terrorism and to non-state entities. We've experienced that. We've seen it across the globe.
Mr. Secretary, you spoke of, critically of leakers of classified information. What was that about?
Well, Dan, it was this. With the end of the Cold War and a relaxation of tension in the world, there seems among the people who handle classified information to have a parallel relaxation. And it's terribly important for us to understand that for people who are authorized to deal with classified information all across the range of government, they have a responsibility to see that they do not provide that information to people who are not cleared for it in a way that would prevent us from being able to track down and deal with the people who perpetrated these crimes.
Are you talking about people in Congress who are briefed from time to time?
I'm talking about any human being who has access to classified information and proceeds to violate federal criminal law and put the men and women in uniform at risk of their lives because of their willfulness or their carelessness.
Mr. Secretary, what can you tell us about the death toll and the numbers of people wounded from the attack on the Pentagon?
Well, the President was here today to express his appreciation to all the firemen and the policemen and the FBI and the teams from all over Virginia and Maryland, and for the wonderful work they're doing just outside of this building. The casualty count is continuing. The roster counts are continuing. The number, I am reasonably confident at this stage, will be considerably less than the figure that's been widely reported in the press of some 800 people. Exactly what number it will be remains to be seen, and I think it's not really fair to the families and friends and colleagues of the victims to be speculating about a number at this stage.
Secretary Rumsfeld, when will we know? When will we have a more or less final death and wounded toll?
Well, just outside this wall, they are in the process of trying to clear away the center section where the aircraft impacted and then went through 3 of the so-called rings of the Pentagon, filled with jet fuel, spewing it everywhere and burning the entire section to the point that it collapsed. They need to remove all that. How long that will take, I don't know. It's a dangerous effort. They're in the process of removing bodies as they find them, and it is very sad and difficult work and dangerous work.
Mr. Secretary, what impact will these terror attacks have on financing of our military?
I really haven't thought about that. There is no question but that a broad, sustained effort against terrorism is something that is not done cheaply, and funds will be required.
Mr. Secretary, you were a fighter pilot in the U.S. Navy, flew off carrier decks. You were a defense secretary once before. Did you ever think that you would live to see the day that someone could knock this kind of hole and kill this many people at the heart of our Defense Department?
No, indeed. The last time I was here, there were people who would throw things at the building during the Vietnam War, dig graves, and try to destroy computers and that type of thing. But it is unimaginable to be sitting in your office and feel the entire building shake, and then walk out there 3 minutes after the impact and see the devastation and the parts of airplanes spread for hundreds of feet all across the side of the building is an appalling situation.
And you never thought you'd live to see the day?
No, indeed.
Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, thank you.
Thank you.
The full breadth of the American continent is not enough to insulate people from the fear that these terror attacks on the East Coast have triggered. Bill Whitaker, now in Los Angeles, has the West Coast story. Bill?
Dan, this was a day when people in the American West tried to get back to normal. Schools and tourist attractions reopened, but for the most part, getting back to normal just wasn't possible.
Why can we not go home?
CBS News has learned the border near San Diego, the busiest crossing in the world, closed down for hours last night after a man described as having a Middle Eastern accent called saying a bomb was about to go off. Across the border, 35 Iraqis were arrested in a Tijuana hotel. Not terrorists as first reported in Mexico, just immigrants hoping to enter the U.S. illegally. The blast in New York sent shockwaves across the country. In Salt Lake City, shaken Olympic organizers are rethinking security for next year's Winter Games.
It does make us sit back and think, okay, now is a plan, can we really do what the plan says it can do?
Los Angeles, where people boast of living on the cutting edge, today was just edgy. Again, downtown, there were more cops than office workers. At the federal building, FBI agents checked everything and everybody, even the mail. Schools tried to get back to normal, but it's just too early.
If that happened, who knows if it could happen again. This is the United States, and it kind of seemed like a movie that was happening. It didn't seem real.
They tried to get back to normal in San Diego, too, but normal today is downtown checkpoints and frightened workers.
It just doesn't feel appropriate. It just doesn't feel as if we should be doing this, you know.
In fact, with airports closed, travel was far from normal. East to west Amtrak trains are booked solid. At the port of Los Angeles, federal agents are stopping and inspecting every cargo ship before it enters. The Armageddon-like scenes inflame the passions of some and retaught painful lessons to others, like visitors to the Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor.
I felt like Pearl Harbor was our message to be careful, to be vigilant, and that was the lesson we learned, is that you can never let your guard down, no matter how certain we feel we're in control.
In control is not what most people here are feeling. In fact, it's just the opposite. It'll take a lot more time and a lot more trying before any sense of normalcy can return. Dan?
Live in Los Angeles, Bill Whitaker. Thanks. Among the many questions about the coordinated attack on America, how did U.S. intelligence fail to find out about it and stop it? CBS's Eric Ingberg has been looking into this.
Reports are that most every ship in the harbor has been hit.
60 years ago, the Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor became the uncontested model for a U.S. government, tragically asleep at the switch. Now, as the smoke settles over a new day of infamy, questions are hardening over why officials failed to detect any aspect of what was obviously a carefully planned attack. The total U.S. intelligence budget is classified, but it's generally believed to exceed $30 billion. Much of that goes to high-tech surveillance equipment like satellites for taking photographs and detecting missile launches, and radio interception equipment that enables U.S. experts to listen in on foreign communications. This technical spying, experts say, works when the target is a country like the old Soviet Union or China, but is less effective at penetrating terrorist groups.
Human intelligence, spies, is really about the only way you're going to learn something about these terrorist groups. They don't lend themselves to picking up intelligence with satellites.
Groups like Osama bin Laden's are small and largely filled by people who know each other. Hard to track, even harder to penetrate. Their phone calls and computer messages may be picked out of the air by the antennas of the super-secret National Security Agency. But that doesn't mean the U.S. will immediately understand a threat.
You're talking about millions and millions of communications and a handful of linguists. You have to intercept that communication. Sometimes it sits in recorders on tape for days before it's actually even listened to. The problem is you may pick up the right communications, a key signal indicating that a terrorist incident is going to happen, but because of the few people you have working on it, it may take a week before you ever get to it.
And one of the tasks now underway behind the high walls of the NSA is what's known in the spy business as retrospective analysis, sorting through all the electronic intercepts of recent months, looking for mentions of words like Boston, 757, World Trade Center, words we now know had a deadly significance. Eric Engberg, CBS News, Washington.
Making the rounds now is a chilling story about Ramzi Youssef, a protege of Osama bin Laden, convicted of masterminding the previous attack on the World Trade Center in 1993. 6 years ago, Youssef was being delivered by helicopter to New York for trial. As Newsweek magazine reports it, as they flew over Lower Manhattan, an FBI agent pointed to the Twin Towers and said, "See, you didn't get them all, after all." Youssef looked down and said, "Not yet." With the World Trade Center towers now in ruins and possibly thousands of people still in those ruins, it's not a good sign that so few survivors have been found today. CBS News medical correspondent Elizabeth Caledon has the latest on the casualties and the ER doctors waiting to treat them. Elizabeth?
Well, Dan, with the additional building collapse earlier this afternoon, officials here at St. Vincent's Hospital remain on high alert for a new round of injuries and casualties. But for the most part, this has been a fairly frustrating day for the medical workers in the New York City area as the extent of damage becomes clear. But overall, the number of injured and people who could be treated and helped remained relatively low, and most of those were rescue crews.
All through the night, the ambulances came, ferrying the wounded from the hell that is Lower Manhattan to area hospitals and triage sites where emergency workers catalog the injuries.
What they're treating right now mostly is eye debris, respiratory debris, things that are causing problems to the rescues who are working, but nothing life-threatening that we saw.
But by morning, many stretchers and wheelchairs remained unused. Doctors and nurses stood by empty-handed. Some even left hospitals to volunteer in the field, bracing themselves for what they might see.
Do you feel emotionally equipped to deal with what you might see?
Not at all. Not by any stretch of the imagination.
As the day wore on, there was a growing sense of dread that survivors would be few.
Since yesterday afternoon or evening until now, most of what we've seen have been, in fact, the rescue effort workers and not necessarily the primary victims who were already in the building.
Doctors from around the country are calling in to volunteer.
I literally have hundreds of requests of physicians all over the country to come in and try to help.
At St. Vincent's Hospital, 426 people were treated by late afternoon, the majority rescue workers suffering respiratory problems from inhaling the thick ash and dust blanketing the destruction. Others suffered cut and battered hands from trying to dig people out with their fingers. Fire Lieutenant Robert Pesci was hit by falling debris and now has broken ribs. But he has bigger concerns.
I have personal friends that are missing. My old company, my old company where I used to work, the whole company's missing.
And Dan, that remains one of the biggest concerns for healthcare workers tonight, that those in greatest need of help may in fact not even have surfaced yet. And as the hours and minutes tick by, the likelihood that they ever will gets slimmer. Dan?
Elizabeth Caledon reporting live from St. Vincent's Hospital in downtown Manhattan. The rescue effort in downtown Manhattan involves more than medical help. It is also a rescue effort by sea, as Lee Cowan reports. Lee?
Well, Dan, ask anybody down here. It has been 2 days of getting by with very little. But today, some urgently needed supplies as well as medical care that couldn't get in by land did end up arriving by sea. The waters that make Manhattan an island are now the waters that connect it with help from across the country.
How many trips are you going to be making back and forth today?
As many as we need to.
All night long?
As many as we need to.
So with the city streets clogged, blocked by debris, the fastest way for rescuers to get to the scene is sometimes by boat. Within hours, one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world had suddenly become a lifeline, with every type of boat imaginable making the crossing from New Jersey to Manhattan. On board, water, clothes, food, medicine, all accompanied by a healthy dose of fear.
I have no idea what to expect right now.
For Joe Iacovone, it was a matter of pitching in. For the Coast Guard, it was a matter of duty.
So how many trips have you guys made?
Numerous, uncountable, sir. It's been nonstop.
In the moments after the attack, the Coast Guard took control of the harbor, clearing the way for a steady stream of boats, filled with willing hearts, now able to lend a hand. Zelda Schuster is a registered nurse, today volunteering to head back into a place she knows well.
I took care of the men that died while those buildings were going up. I'm just outraged. I'm absolutely outraged.
Outraged that today turned to an outpouring of kindness. The Coast Guard has been working 9-hour shifts. The private boats have been essentially working around the clock, and there is no indication tonight that that help is going to end anytime soon. Dan.
Lee Cowan, thank you. A reminder now, for those of you with access to the internet, you can get the very latest developments 24/7 by clicking on our CBS News website at cbs.com. You're watching continuing CBS News coverage of the attack on America. Dan Rather with a special edition of the CBS Evening News, continuing coverage of the attack on America and the late developments. Here are the headlines. Secondary building collapses raised huge new clouds of smoke and dust tonight in the battered and still dangerous financial district of Lower Manhattan. Investigators say up to 24 knife-wielding terrorists hijacked the 4 jetliners used in yesterday's suicide attacks, and at least some of those skyjackers learned to fly in the United States. Officials say there's now credible evidence the hijackers of the plane that hit the Pentagon originally meant to destroy the White House but turned away, reason unknown. And the official death toll in the World Trade Center attacks, not counting those on the hijacked jets, is now a confirmed 55, but thousands are still missing. Now some of the other developments of today. Rescue teams are working round the clock in the rubble of the World Trade Towers, risking their lives, trying to find victims of the disaster. President Bush said the attacks were not just acts of terror, they were acts of war, a war he vowed we will win. New polls indicate there's widespread American public support for retaliation. Congress reconvened today in a public show of unity to condemn the attack on the United States. Air travel was grounded for a second day as airlines prepared to resume some flying under strict new security. The U.S. financial markets were closed again, but the United States and our allies vowed that these acts of terror will not destabilize the world economy. Federal investigators are following hundreds of leads tonight to try to find out who was behind the attacks and bring them to justice. The attack on the Twin Towers sent shockwaves rolling across Europe. Expressions of sympathy for the victims was mixed with fear of where the next target could be. CBS's Richard Roth has the story.
We're out the front now, ladies and gents, please.
Europe's feeling edgy. A security alert briefly cleared the courtyard at the Prime Minister's office in London, and 1,000 extra police were on the streets of the capital. The British called it just a precaution. But newspapers on the continent were calling it a world afraid as the shock was seeping in.
Yesterday was indeed a dark day.
Pope John Paul spoke of unspeakable sorrow to the pilgrims in St. Peter's Square. And in London, the Prime Minister told the press there's an urgent new issue at the top of the world agenda: terrorism.
Where these groups are, how they operate, how they are financed, how they are supported, and how they are stopped.
Roadblocks and random searches now are slowing traffic outside airports, and security inside is slowing the tide of travelers, except for American travelers headed home, who were not just delayed, but stranded by the cancellation of flights to the U.S.
We've been here since 3:30 yesterday afternoon, and we were taken off the plane.
Security's been stepped up too at military bases, and where American GIs are stationed in Europe, some were frustrated by what's starting to feel like a new world disorder.
We're powerless. I mean, everybody in the States, we got an email today saying, put your American flags up. What can we do? I mean, we can't do anything, because if we do, we're a target.
A police escort led the U.S. ambassador to work here, a battle-ready Marine on the embassy roof. There's tension over feeling safe and at the same time feeling sorry. A memorial service for Americans tonight at a church in London underlined the worry the world seems to have, an uncertainty about the future.
It was a little bit isolating. I really felt like I wanted to be with other people who were going to understand.
At the American Embassy, Prince Charles delivered condolences from the royal family. There's abundant sympathy and symbols of grief for America's tragedy, but it's still impossible here to comprehend its scale or what may be its consequence. Richard Roth, CBS News, London.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has condemned the attacks in New York and Washington as a, and I quote, blatant challenge to humanity. But Moscow may provide the U.S. with something more concrete than condolences, as we hear now from CBS's Elizabeth Palmer.
All day long outside the American embassy, the mound of flowers grew as Russians came to pay their respects and express their grief. We are with you, America, the messages say. We offer our support. President Vladimir Putin has ordered a minute of silence Thursday to honor the victims of this week's attacks. But experts here say that Russia may also be offering intelligence information and even military backup if Osama bin Laden is responsible and the U.S. decides on reprisals in Afghanistan. Although Russia doesn't share a border with Afghanistan, its troops are already stationed in the former Soviet Republic of Tajikistan. These bases could provide valuable information and logistical support for an American retaliatory strike on Afghan soil. When asked about this level of cooperation, the American ambassador to Russia was non-committal.
Well, I don't think I would want to speculate about any kinds of response options or what we might or might not do with other countries. But certainly, we've already had the issue of counterterrorism on our agenda.
But the Russians probably know better than anyone that a mixture of rugged terrain and fierce fighters make Afghanistan a dangerous place to attack. 10 years of bloody war between Soviet soldiers and Afghan guerrillas in the 1980s resulted in 15,000 Soviet dead and a humiliating defeat. Grigory Bondarevsky was an advisor to the Soviet army during that war.
During the 19th century, the British waged 2 bloody wars against Afghanistan and lost. In 1919, 20th century, they lost 3 times. Now we waged a war, we lost. So the situation is extremely difficult.
Even if America does decide on retaliation in Afghanistan, it's sure to have serious reservations about substantial Russian help. But the very fact that such cooperation is even remotely possible shows that for the first time in a long time, Russia and America believe they face a common enemy. Elizabeth Palmer, CBS News, Moscow.
Let me show you something and take you somewhere. Take you to Lower Manhattan tonight. This is a live picture of the scene, eerie, as night falls. In the center of your picture, stream from a fire hose, still trying to put out fires down there, still choking smoke and smog and the leftover from debris. Keep in mind, at least portions, if not complete, 4 buildings collapsed in the last 3 or 4 hours, and a 5th building was reported wobbling. Still, brave firemen, policemen, and other rescue and relief workers are digging. They will be digging this night and many nights still to come. In Washington, Congress convened today under tight security and a rare show of unity. Our CBS News Chief Washington correspondent Bob Schieffer has a report for you on that. Good evening, Bob.
How are you, Dan? I want to tell you, Dan, people here were really shaken yesterday when this Capitol behind me was evacuated. It was because police told the people inside that a plane like the one that had hit the Twin Towers might be headed this way. That didn't happen, but you don't forget a day like that. A lone man playing the national anthem on a trumpet only added to the eeriness that greeted elected officials and their aides as they returned to work today. And the extraordinary new security precautions were a reminder, if one was needed, that the danger has not yet passed. Whatever the terrorist objectives, it was soon clear that what they had accomplished is this. They had unified a Congress that until yesterday had agreed on virtually nothing.
This is war. And we will do everything in our power together to make sure that terrorists never, ever again can create this mayhem, this chaos, this violence against our people and our country.
Whatever we call it, we must put ourselves in a war footing. We must make up our minds we're going to fight this scourge of the world.
Torricelli of New Jersey said it is not enough to track down the individual terrorists.
The organizations themselves must be eliminated so that this can never happen again.
The aim, said McCain of Arizona, must be to break the back of terrorism.
I say to our enemies, we are coming. God may show you mercy. We will not.
Miller of Georgia called for an attack on the country of Afghanistan because it has reportedly harbored terrorists for years.
I say bomb the hell out of them. If there's collateral damage, so be it. They certainly found our American civilians to be expendable.
At this point, no one else here has been willing to go that far, but there is a consensus building that when we find out exactly who did this, there has to be a payback, and it may not be delicate. Dan.
Bob Schieffer, reporting live from Capitol Hill. It was not business as usual in the nation's capital today, and as Cheryl Atkinson reports, that included government business and the tourist business.
Today, the shell-shocked nation's capital
All right, have a great day.
struggled to return to normalcy under conditions that were anything but.
It is truly hideous.
The usual political graffiti replaced by an anonymous message of sympathy.
Don't even know what to think at this point. It's so unbelievable. It's so surreal.
There was no morning rush hour, no school. Many businesses were closed. And there was an extraordinary police presence.
And not just Washington, D.C. police, but military police, National Guard soldiers with their Humvees parked along the streets. It's a sight more commonly seen in other countries, but almost unheard of in the United States.
It is strange riding my bike down M Street and seeing military police and, National Reserve on corners and Hummers.
Yet there was an amazing sense of resolve on the streets, too. Federal employees who came to work today felt like they made an important statement.
I felt like this is my part as an American to show that I'm not afraid to return to my life as normal.
By coming to work and having things up and running, it's giving a message that, hey, we're not going to shut down because something like this did happen.
Even tourists voiced the same determination. These Milwaukee couples resumed sightseeing after their harrowing evacuation from the Capitol yesterday.
We can't let them know that it's fear, because we can't be run by fear. And so that's why we're here.
And if tourists did stick around, they got uncanny access to some of the best sights. Tanya Vollmer and her friend even got a tour of the White House this morning.
And then we just want to see if the city is still closed, and everything was open and you can go everywhere. We can go in the White House, and we never thought that it would be possible.
And that's the collective message from the nation's capital. We did not close up shop today.
Things will get back to normal. Security might be tighter at airports and things, but, I think we have the spirit to go on.
Cheryl and CBS News, Washington.
The cowardly attacks without warning against innocent civilians left Americans stunned. Now the shock is turning to anger and determination. CBS News correspondent Richard Schlesinger has more tonight about what your neighbors are saying. Richard?
Dan, the first numbers measuring the level of American rage are startling. CBS News started calling people around the country last night when pictures of the attacks and the aftermath were fresh and emotions were raw. The portrait those numbers paint of American resolve shows a nation that is united in its fury and looking for a target. Fifth Avenue, New York City, 24 hours after the attack. It was as peaceful as a Sunday morning. But this is midweek in Midtown. This is what the attack has done to this city. Virtually empty streets, a police presence so huge they had to use cadets from the police academy, and just offshore, an aircraft carrier ready for anything. There is now evidence that since the attack, the nation is ready for anything. According to our CBS News poll, 57% of the people questioned around the country believe the U.S. will go to war. And an overwhelming majority of Americans agree with this man.
I've talked to friends who are Republicans, Democrats, Independents, and I can't believe the consensus of everybody. Retaliation is the #1 thing that we must do.
And there's evidence that the nation's anger is stronger than it's been in years. 66% of Americans surveyed last night support retaliating, even if innocent civilians are killed.
It's just such a heinous crime that whatever retaliation is necessary, I actually support.
Only 20% said they would not support retaliation if innocent civilians are killed.
Obviously, we're going to have to take very strong measures. It's terrifying to think what they're going to be and what they're going to cost.
Whatever the president needs of me, I'm prepared to do. Show me the line and I'll be in it.
Surprisingly, in the wake of the worst terrorist attack on this country in history, a majority of Americans feel safe where they live. Only 43% of those polled said they're concerned about terrorist attacks in their communities. 56% said they are not. People in the West and in rural areas feel safer.
I don't think that it could happen here. I don't think so.
A majority of the people polled said they believe when it comes right down to it, there's just not enough security to guard against terrorism in the U.S. And some of the anger in the country is directed at the U.S. government. By more than 2 to 1, the people we polled said the same thing some Americans said after Pearl Harbor. Intelligence agencies should have known about the attacks in advance. And the majority of people in the polls said there is not enough security guarding against terrorism in this country. Dan.
Richard Schlesinger, thanks. We're beginning to learn more about the passengers aboard the 4 doomed hijacked airliners, learning about them in some cases from their own last desperate cell phone calls to loved ones. Jerry Bowen in Los Angeles has been compiling their stories.
They were among the very first victims of Tuesday's terror. Businessman Tim Ward heading home to Southern California, his mother in grief tonight.
Just pray for healing for everybody. That's all I can ask.
David Angel, producer of TV's Frasier, and his wife Lynn, coming back for the Emmy Awards. All passengers on American Airlines Flight 11, the jet-turned-missile that hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Tom McGinnis was co-pilot, a Navy veteran from Miramar's Top Gun flight school.
He was chivalrous and showed the kind of compassion for everyone that you don't really see much these days.
It was United Flight 175 that sliced into the South Tower, an image burned into the mind's eye of anyone who saw it. 22-year-old Lisa Frost, first in her class at Boston University, was aboard, headed to the West Coast, and a new job, said her father.
My wife and I are just missing our daughter, and we give everything back just to have her back.
Garnett Ace Bailey and Mark Bavis were scouts for the Los Angeles Kings hockey team, coming back for today's opening practice.
Ace Bailey and Mark Bavis, they're hockey people. They're professionals, and what they would both be saying is get the hell out there and get playing.
The jet forced into the Pentagon was American Airlines Flight 77. Chris Newton was on it, the young CEO of a Cypress, California company. He just moved his wife and 2 children to Virginia and was flying back for the family dog.
Being there
I think he was thinking that he was going to limit the amount of his flying that he was going to be doing so that he could spend more time with his family, and he felt that was a better place to raise his kids.
Barbara Olson, attorney, TV commentator, and the wife of Solicitor General Ted Olson, made 2 brief calls to her husband from the plane, revealing the hijackers were armed with knives. Georgetown University professor Leslie Whittington was taking her husband and 2 young daughters on the trip of their lives. There was joy in her last voicemail.
My family and I are off in Australia, where we'll be until late November. We'll see you when we're back.
It was United Flight 93 that crashed in the Pennsylvania countryside. By all accounts, something heroic happened to steer it there. Passenger Tom Burnett, mourned at a memorial service in San Francisco last night, had telephoned his family from the doomed plane.
He said that a group of them were getting ready to do something, and then he hung up and he never called back.
31-year-old Mark Bingham called too. His mother wants to think he was also a hero.
Perhaps the passengers were able to thwart these people in some way.
They were among the very first victims of Tuesday's terror, and yet different from the still countless victims on the ground. Different because they knew of the horror to come. Jerry Bowen, CBS News, Los Angeles.
As for the men who committed these despicable crimes, the more we learn about them, the more they sound like villains concocted by a paranoid conspiracy theorist. They were nothing of the kind. My 60 Minutes colleague, correspondent Ed Bradley, has been digging into that. Ed?
Dan, yesterday 4 different groups of terrorists arrived at airports in Boston, Washington, and Newark almost simultaneously. Each hijacked a commercial jetliner, and in 3 of those cases made pinpoint strikes at their intended targets. It was, by all appearances, a stunning exhibition of planning and execution.
The scope and success of the coordinated assaults are frightening indicators to some experts that we are seeing a new breed of terrorists.
There was an organization that was big, that was capable, that was organized, that was sophisticated, and it was operating right under our nose, and we didn't see it.
Right, oh my God, another plane has just hit.
The U.S. Attorney General confirmed that assessment today when he revealed that at least some of the terrorists received flight training here in the U.S.
A number of the suspected hijackers were trained as pilots in the United States.
This is not the riffraff.
Judith Miller has studied Islamic terrorism for 20 years and sees in this disaster the signature of Osama bin Laden or some of the scores of aspiring terrorists he's trained.
Literally thousands of well-educated people who are sent to countries like ours and to Europe to act as sleeper agents who lie in wait for their moment of activation.
It's entirely possible, perhaps probable, that yesterday's attack had been in the works for years, following the pattern of the 1998 U.S. Embassy bombings in East Africa.
There was 5 years of preparation. People were sent to scout out targets 5 years before the U.S. embassies in Africa were blown up.
There's even a theory that yesterday's 4-pronged attack was a collective act of different terrorist cells, each with no knowledge of what the others were doing.
So what they do is they build firewalls and to protect each particular cell, so that what happens is if any one of them are caught, then of course they can't say anything about any other part of the operation.
While the terrorist operation may have been sophisticated, what's not clear is whether it was expensive. At least one of the terrorists received flight training for just $10,000 in this country. And the possibility that all of this might have been done without a great deal of funding, Dan, that makes it all the more frightening.
Ed Bradley, thanks. And a New Yorker will tell you there was a strange sense of dislocation today, as if people living next to a mountain awakened one morning to find it had vanished. The majestic twin towers of the World Trade Center seemed to anchor the southern end of Manhattan like some vast rock formation. Yet tonight, they're gone. How could that happen? CBS's John Blackstone found out.
The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, destroyed yesterday, were once more than dominating features of the Manhattan skyline. They were symbols of achievement and success. From the observation decks on the top floors, tourists from around the world got their most memorable views of New York. When the World Trade Center was built in the 1960s, its soaring steel columns made it like nothing constructed before. Huge prefabricated sections were hoisted into position as the towers grew higher at an impressive pace.
In retrospect, would it have been different had there been more supporting beams in a greater area around this building?
Well, frankly, it's hard to imagine a building having more steel than this structure.
The innovative design was like a square donut. The strength was in the steel columns of the outer walls and the steel of the central core. At the beginning, the towers seemed incredibly stable, each apparently absorbing the impact of a Boeing 767 traveling at close to 500 miles an hour. The explosion of jet fuel that followed was the equivalent of a massive bomb, says physics professor Stephen Block.
The energy in a fully laden 767 is nearly equal to a kiloton of TNT being exploded. This is a staggering amount of energy, and it's equivalent, roughly speaking, to about a 20th of the energy that was deposited in the bomb that leveled Hiroshima.
But still, the towers stood. The blazing jet fuel, however, created fires burning hot enough to weaken the steel that held the World Trade Center high.
Wasn't the shaking? It was fire.
It was definitely the fire that took the building down.
As the fire burned on, experts say, temperatures rose above 1,000 degrees to the point where steel loses its strength.
Once it began to fail, it dragged in the floors and proceeded to pancake floor by floor so that the entire building collapsed, which was not necessary.
Architect Jim Malott says new standards for fireproofing and structural support may grow from this tragedy.
When you build something this big, it better not fail.
Engineers and architects say it's likely to be a long time before any more 100-story high-rises are built. In fact, across the country, almost every high-rise building seems suddenly more fragile and vulnerable. John Blackstone, CBS News, San Francisco.
Whatever shortcomings there may or may not have been in the design of the World Trade Center towers, there is no faulting the courage and dedication of New York City's firefighters. Jim Axelrod has the view from the front lines.
They are, in a word, speechless.
Sir, what's it like in there?
Weary and weak, they emerge.
There's no training like a day like this. Never. Regular fires and everything you train, but nothing like this.
Knowing hundreds of their fellow rescue workers are missing.
The thing is that we don't even know how many are in there right now.
And probably dead.
I have 13 of my brothers unaccounted for from my particular firehouse alone.
These are the people who always run toward what others flee, and yesterday was no different. But today is, because so many of the unaccounted for are the officers who'd normally be calling the shots. Among them, the city's chief of special operations, a deputy commissioner, and a department chaplain.
I don't know what to say. We lost people that have given over 40 years.
So for now, the rescue workers in this city have to improvise the impossible.
Piece by piece. We get whatever command structure we have left, we put them together, and then they start a strategy.
Look behind me. Where do you begin? And how much more difficult when so many of the people who would normally answer that question are buried in that? Where do you begin? With rule number 1 of the rescue business. For every fallen hero, send 10 in his place. Where is Newport? Newport, Rhode Island.
The help is coming from everywhere.
No, we didn't get the official phone call, but we just had to come. Tell me real quick where you're from.
City of Passaic. We're out of the city of Passaic, New Jersey.
From Passaic in North Brunswick, New Jersey, Utica, New York, East Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, Dexter, Michigan.
Drive down?
Drove. We just drove last night.
We just have to go in. We have to go in and get our brothers out.
Tonight, New York's fire department is disoriented and devastated, but not defeated.
We had people here last night, and we're here again today, and we'll be here tomorrow.
It's what always happens in catastrophes, even one that's never happened before.
Did you have pictures of your colleagues going through your head as you're in there?
It hasn't stopped since this happened. So that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm not leaving, and I'm not going home until every one of them are back with us.
Whether they're dead or alive.
Yep.
Tonight there are reports of up to 7 firefighters rescued and rushed to hospitals. It's a strange feeling for those still searching. Friends are dead, commanders gone, and yet the backup keeps coming. Strangers who somehow feel like brothers. Jim Axelrod, CBS News, New York.
With us now is one of the thousands of brave people risking their lives in the rescue effort, Frank Rella. Mr. Rella is a paramedic. Thank you for joining us. Our admiration for what you're doing knows no bounds. How eerie is it to be working under these circumstances?
Well, sir, it's nothing that you could ever train for or you can ever anticipate. It's part of our lives. I mean, we go in there every day, we try to do the best we can for people, but it's nothing that you could ever anticipate happening.
What's the worst of it?
Worst of it is not being able to find patients or our brothers, firefighters, or the police that have been lost. I mean, we're here to save people, and especially paramedics and EMTs. We're here to treat patients, and we can't find any patients.
How realistic is it to believe that at this late time there may still be people alive in the debris, Mr. Rilla?
Well, sir, I think it's the only thing that really can keep us going is just saying that there are people there, and we're going to get them out, and we're going to make sure that we'll stay here until it's done.
You do or do not have a sense of real and present danger as you're going about this work?
Well, I don't think we think about that. I think somebody being trapped is more important than us being afraid. I mean, anybody who doesn't fear is crazy, but we don't let that fear get to us. The people that are out there and still out there are going to go in there and at risk of their own personal safety, they'll do what they have to do. They'll do their jobs and they'll do it well.
You say they'll do their jobs and do it well.
Yes, sir.
You'll do your jobs and you'll do it well.